when you're actually faced with a patient in front of you, they're not going to have multiple choice down their forehead, be like, all right, this is what you do. I did basically 34 hours in 2 days, which is not usually what we do, but I did that. And then before that, I did like another 16-hour shift.
If anyone's working for 24 hours, I don't want them tending to me anytime after hour like 12 to 24, like, which is crazy.
A ward week for me may be about 7,500 to 10,000. A night could be up to 10 to 12,000.
A night?
In one night.
One night.
I haven't looked at the statistics, but Canada, unless you're looking at China and India, is probably one of the hardest in the world to get into. It's way easier to get into the States than it is to Canada. When we started off, like we had maybe 100, 125 people in our class. By the time I graduated, there's only about 20 to 25 of us that graduated.
That is very, very competitive. So that's like a lot of exposure to many different areas of medicine.
100%.
So by the end of it, you can pretty much say, I really enjoy this.
Yes.
I don't like this.
Yes.
See, this is what other professions are lacking. Healthcare's got this. What is residency?
Residency is a beast.
If you're becoming a doctor, I really, really think everyone should know that it's going to be a Hello, everybody. Welcome to the My Career Shop podcast. Today with me to discuss the profession of a doctor for the second time, but the MD route, is Anil Krishna Sharma, an internal medicine doctor, general internal medicine doctor, someone I've known for a very long period of time. If you watch some of my old episodes, you would know that I'm always talking about a doctor who is incredibly passionate and wanted to become a doctor from day one. This is that young fella, and
not so young.
Happy to have you here to discuss the profession of medicine. And how are you doing, man?
I'm doing great, man. Thanks for having me here at my own home.
By the way, we had multiple takes just to get this thing started. As I know him, this was informal and became very, very informal. Enjoy the interview. It's probably going to be really good.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, now you're so formal. So the first question I had is, what is a doctor of medicine? And the only reason why I even asked this is because in the other episode with Dr. Evan Gray, I had a doctor of osteopathic medicine, and that went into the world of osteopathy and all that. So what's an MD? Take me through it.
So first off, I did watch that episode. It was excellent. Well done. So thumbs up to both of you guys. So for MD, so medical doctor, it's really the same as a DO, but the difference is we're slightly more focused on the pathophysiology. And in general for us, you kind of go through the whole steps of going through undergrad, then going to med school. Then from med school, you go into residency. Then from residency, then you become an attending. So it's the same kind of steps as DO. I would say that we're not as much focused on in terms of the physical aspects, depending on the specialty. For me, I can only really speak to general internal medicine, but an MD is basically, it's a professional designation as a physician, but it's just more focused on the pathophysiology and the treatment methods that are more pharmacological, although we always recommend doing more of the non-pharmacological before the pharmacological, but we kind of focus, or more of our training is more in the pharmacological therapies.
Yeah. So osteopathy, I mean, it was the physical manipulation, but they were also saying that they look at mind, body, and spirit in the consideration. And I thought that was somewhat of the difference, right? I don't think, definitely spirit is not considered. I think MDs also go down the mind and body, right? So I guess that would be somewhat of the difference, because they have to take extra credits just for that, right? Like to become a DO, you have to study a little bit more because it's all the MD training, plus the
physical manipulations, that like kind of like in a sense like a mix of like chiropractor, physiotherapy along with the MD. So I'd find that a lot harder route, but I would say from the DO perspective, it seems nice because if a patient comes in and there's something you could do right away that can help them, that's pretty awesome. For us, generally, we don't really do much more of that physical manipulation. It's more like, okay, here's the prescription, or this is what we recommend. And sometimes it takes a while for the patients to feel better, but I would say that's kind of a little bit of a difference, but very similar otherwise.
Yeah. Well, I did a lot of research on DO and MD, and I found most DOs pretty much practice as MDs, right? A large percentage of them go into primary care. Although you can go into any specialty, a large percent of them go down that route. And supposedly they don't really use the osteopathic teachings that much.
Yeah.
Right. So they're like MDs with a DO designation. And I could have encountered many DOs. I don't even know because they're not required to tell you I'm an MD or a DO or anything, right? They're just doctors.
Yeah. And by the way, that's the same for if you're like an IMG that comes in, you have an MBBS. Like say
What's an IMG?
So international medical graduate. So say if you're from China or India, they have like a physician designation there. I think in India it's called MBBS. And then they come in, but they're also like they're basically a physician. Our designation overall is just physicians. Just the professional accreditations are just a little different. But to be practicing in Canada and in Ontario, you need to have certain accreditations on top of that.
Let's talk about that in a bit.
Okay.
So how many years of experience do you have as a doctor?
So I started during the pandemic as a staff. It was in 2020.
When did you start your residency?
So I started residency back in 2016. So from 2016 to 2020, I was a resident. Prior to that, I was a med student for 4 years. But once you graduate from medical school, you actually have a designation of MD. And then from there, you can not really practice the MD, so you can't write prescriptions until you finish formal training for residency. You can kind of prescribe under another physician as a resident, so which you always have what we call an attending. So an attending is just someone who's gone through residency, is now basically a staff that writes and signs and prescribes. And then they also train the trainees, such as the residents or the med students.
Okay. So I take it that you've been working since 2016, right? So residency was 4 years.
Correct.
And that's for general internal medicine.
Yeah.
And you were telling me that was a distinction between US and Canada.
So in Canada, internal medicine is not really considered primary care, but we can do primary care. We're just a little bit more specialized, more hospital-based, but we can also do clinics. So in Canada, it's a 4-year minimum. You can also do a 5-year of a general internal medicine. That's more focused on academics. So if you want to practice in an academic institution, say, for example, McMaster or UFT, you typically need to have at least 5 years, and then generally you need to get a master's or a PhD on top of that. But you kind of do it in the same time. For me, I just did general internal medicine, which is just 4 years. And then from prior to that, if you wanted to go into, say, a subspecialty, so anything inside the body, so like basically like cardiology, respirology, nephrology, rheumatology, these specialties, you need to do at least 3 years of internal medicine. Then from there, you apply for your specialty, and then it varies.
Is that a fellowship?
Yeah, so that's the fellowship aspect. So fellowship is basically, so after 3 years of internal medicine, then you're like kind of like a fellow of internal medicine if I do a 4th year. Or if you're applying to a subspecialty, you're like a fellow in your specialty of training, such as cardiology or respirology. Yeah.
There's the actual residency for general internal medicine is 3 years.
Yes.
Anything after that is fellowship, and you're specializing, and
Correct.
all the jobs that you look for from there on are more likely going to be under whatever you did your fellowship under.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And under general internal medicine, are there like any element of the body, I mean, any part of the body you can do a fellowship in? Like essentially like you said, cardiology.
Basically, I look at it as like inside the body. So except for neuro. So the brain is like its own separate field. So neurology is its own separate field. You have to do neurology training, not internal medicine training. Dermatology, it's separate training as well. And then surgical specialties are their own separate training. And then psychiatry is its own separate training. And then OB-GYN, obstetric gynecology, is its own. But other than that, inside the body, that's the way I think of internal medicine is like, yes, we do neuro, but we're not neuro trained in terms of like the more details of that. But it's, say, for example, say endocrinology, so thyroid or diabetes, respirology, so from the lungs, cardiology from the heart, nephrology from the kidneys, hepatology from the liver, GI, gastroenterology, which is like scopes and procedures, and then also focusing on like inflammatory bowel disease, other things as well. So, and then rheumatology is like the joints. So those are kind of the main subspecialties from internal medicine. Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. I thought those were all something you do residency in.
Correct. So in residency,
but that's after though, right?
So no, in residency, you have like, just like as in med school. So when you do your med school, you first start off with 2 years of basic science training, which is basically you're sitting and studying for most of it. This is my training. There's differences in certain hospitals or like colleges like McMaster, they do it a little bit earlier. So after the first 2 years of basic science training, then you go into clerkship. Clerkship is essentially where you go into the hospitals, and in that setting, you do various specialties. So you can choose, hey, I want to be a surgeon. So you could go into like a general surgeon, or then you can even go into subspecialties such as ENTs, like looking at noses, fixing noses. So there's so many varieties there, and you can select anything just to see what you like and what you love. And then, for example, for say, instead of me doing general internal medicine, I could just say, hey, I would like to do a cardiology rotation. So you do that. But in general, we would probably recommend you start off with internal medicine. It's kind of like the base pyramid training before you start going into the subspecialties, but it just depends how it works out on your schedule and your clerkship years.
So how many rotations can you do?
So it's usually rotations are between, it could be as little as 4 weeks. It could be up to 6 to 8 weeks. For me in particular, I went to the Caribbean route, and based on my school in the Caribbean, we had rotations between 4 to 6 weeks up to 8 weeks. And then from there, we would select where we would like to go.
But what level of exposure do you get in each specialty?
So as a med student, you get a lot of exposures, and it depends on who your attending is, how much they want you to do.
I'm talking about different types of specialties.
Different types.
So like, suppose I'm a confused med student. I'm like, oh, I love being a doctor, but
Yes.
I don't really know if I want to be a cardiologist
Yes.
or like rheumatologist. Like,
Yeah.
what level of exposure can I get?
Yes. So you have your core curriculum you have to first go through. So it's basically general surgery, obstetric gynecology, psychiatry, and then you have general internal medicine. Those are like your core. You need to do those first in order
And
to
that's
even
in
graduate.
school?
That's in clerkship. So
Okay.
school is a little different. So let's dial back a little bit.
Yeah.
So when you start off in med school, where I was in the Caribbean, we first did 2 years of basic science training. So that's basically
Since we're on the topic,
Okay.
let's just go all the way to the beginning.
Okay.
Right?
Sure. Yeah.
You're in high school.
Yeah.
Right? Get me to a doctor.
Okay. So high school, basically from grade 9 to grade 12, what you're really trying to accomplish is trying to get an amazing GPA. That's number one. Number two is that you're trying to get a lot of exposures in terms of showing leadership skills, such as, starting off projects, being in groups, certain kind of activities, being part of a lot of different groups, such as leadership roles. Say, for example, if you wanted to like build a plane and fly it, and you could do something like that. Like we did some of that in my high school. Research is not such a big thing in high school, but mainly also showing that you're willing and capable of speaking and communicating with people. So like, for example, volunteering at a senior's home, volunteering at a hospital, doing anything for extra credit. Extracurriculars are very important because that kind of helps stack up your resume. Because GPA, most of these guys, they are all going to have like 3.9s, 4.0. I haven't looked at the statistics, but Canada, unless you're looking at China and India, is probably one of the hardest in the world to get into. It's way easier to get into the States than it is to Canada for med school because it's such a rigorous process.
And by easy,
Easy. Well, it's not
it's
easy,
like,
but it's.
I saw, I believe medicine is the second hardest program in America to get into, right? And the requirements for MD were somewhere in between like 3.7 and 3.8, depending on the school, obviously. And for DOs, it was between 3.55 and 3.7 as well. So, I mean,
It's very competitive.
that is very, very competitive. You basically never got a B during your undergrad.
Yeah.
And you might be allowed 1 B or 2 Bs if you're a DO, like maybe.
And that's just the beginning. That's just the grades, right? It's like all the other things that have to play a role. And then, are you a human being? Like, are you a crazy person? Like they look at all this stuff. Like, are you a weird person or are you someone who can communicate with someone? So all these things play a role. I would say what's important is that, it's just like basically a tick box. So it's like, okay, you have a filter system. So it's like, okay, everybody has this GPA. Everyone below this GPA, you're cut off. Then the rest of them, then they look and then they see what's on their resume, what they've done, what's interesting. And then from there, then they kind of go through the interview process. But I never went through the Canadian process. I went straight to the Caribbean because my GPA was terrible. It was not good enough or competitive enough really to get into Canadian med school.
Yeah. I mean, Canadian med school is very, very difficult to get into. You have to be very studious from day one.
Yeah.
And that needs to be like your sole focus.
Yeah.
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 We had a good time.
Oh yeah. High school was great times.
The university was a great time too.
University was incredible.
Yeah. So what we've learned is have high grades in high school, because I mean, whatever you practice early is what happens later. And so then then you need to get an undergraduate degree, but it doesn't have to be in sciences or anything. You just need to get the prerequisites, right?
Correct. So going into now undergrad, walking through undergrad, I've seen some of my colleagues, they did engineering, or I haven't seen too many have done arts that have gotten in, but there's different programs like you can get into. But the most important, I would say, for high school, if you're gunning for med school, is getting a high GPA, because you want to get into a good program, and a good program would be health science. Life science is what I did. Life science is a lot easier to get into in terms of your GPA doesn't have to be as competitive, but then you're also facing off with a lot more people. Health science is more focused mainly for medical school. And in general, based on what I looked at in Ontario, most of the students that go into health science have a way higher GPA. Number one is because they've obviously worked hard to get there, but also I find that the GPAs are a lot easier to get at that level. Yep. As opposed to, say, life science, when we were doing together, actually, and like, say, chemistry, physics, and all that, it's a little bit more challenging to get
That's
that.
exactly what I heard from someone in health sciences as well.
Yeah.
And so you need a better report card in high school to get into health sci, right? Once you're in health sci, you need a slightly less GPA. You're more just prepared, and they're already pushing you towards med school if you've gone into health sci, right? So that's what I've learned. I've seen, right? It's harder, but so many people from life sci also do it. Then you just need to make sure you have a very, very high GPA.
Correct.
And but you need to also nail some prerequisites to get into medicine, right?
Yeah.
So what are those prerequisites?
So mainly it's like your basic sciences. So it's physics, chemistry, life science, biology. And then there's like organic chemistry, biochemistry, but you also need to have, which I didn't have until later on, was English. So I never really did English until really late on. And English is hard. For me, it was like the toughest subject. I was really good at like mathematics and physics, like that. I loved that. Calculus, all that was easy for me. But yeah, that was probably the hardest, was English. But in general, when you look into what you need to get in for, say, Canadian med school, they will have a set of prerequisites. But in general, you need to have at least your basic sciences covered.
Yeah, it's the same thing in America.
Yeah,
I don't think there's many differences when it comes to becoming a doctor.
Yeah.
I believe the years of residency are a little different, but the process of becoming a doctor is almost identical.
Yeah.
So you get your prerequisites. You obviously have to. What else do you have to do?
So you have to do a lot of like stacking the resume, right? In undergrad, that's the time where you could probably start doing research. You reach out to your professors, see if one likes you, maybe help out. What you're really going to be doing at that stage is just data crunching. You're not going to be doing much more. I mean, some people do other things, but you're really just sitting down for hours, just inputting data. And other than that, I would say, you may be able to get something published, and that's very helpful getting into med school, especially in like Ontario, like U of T. They love people who have research and also papers. But other than research, which depending on where it could be in anything, as long as just some sort of research, it helps because you need to understand the research process. And once you do become a physician, you need to understand how is research done. You need to know what's a good study, what's not a good study, like different versions of that, right? So that I would say is important. Another very important aspect is leadership, right? Like lots of groups that you have to be a part of. I was the VP for this thing called the International Health Organization, which in U of T at the time, we were just basically organizing trips to go to South America. We organized to gain money, fundraise money to like give like kind of basically vitamins to people and say, what were we? We were in not Costa Rica, Nicaragua. So that was actually a fun time. We got exposure there. It showed some leadership skills. So that was helpful. Volunteering is very helpful in the hospital setting, like just being someone who, maybe helps move patients around or talks to them. I would say that's very important too. And then, other than those things, it's like, sports or other activities. But really, the GPA is number one. Like, you need to get that to begin with.
But you also get your letters of recommendation,
correct,
through your relationship with your
professors.
And
that's usually through maybe in your third year or fourth year, because then you're like, the classroom sizes are smaller. You're not having like 300-400 students. You're having maybe like 20-30 students. The professors get to know you, especially if you're doing research with them. It's very helpful as well. So I would say that helps.
Okay. And then obviously you have to write that horrendous exam.
Yeah, the MCAT. So when I wrote it at the time, I think we were writing it together. Yeah. That was a fun time. Yeah. And then you decided to go into law.
Yeah. I was never serious about medicine.
Well, you're doing it to support me. So that was nice.
Yeah, that was, it was like, back in the good old days when all brown people were supposed to become doctors, right? Yeah. I went down that journey and found out, actually for me, volunteering is what kind of turned me off medicine.
Interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
I was like, I don't think I'm cut out for this profession.
Yeah.
Right. But I was so knee deep in science.
Yes.
Right. So I was like, oh man, I guess I got to write this exam too. Right.
Yeah.
And ended up writing the MCAT. I mean, you remember how I studied for that.
That was a tough time.
He took it seriously and he did not look like a normal human for many months.
Oh yeah. That was a very depressing time period, but it was also, you had to be motivated. I actually wrote it twice. The first time I didn't score it. And then the second time I scored it, I was actually pretty competitive with my MCAT score. At the time, it was like rated up to 0 to like 44 or something. But now I think they've changed it. So when we wrote it at the time, I think it was like 4 or 5 hours. And now it's like 8 hours. So they've added different sections to it. But yeah, you need to have a really good MCAT score as well. I think it's McMaster that really focuses more on certain sections, like the verbal section. When we wrote
there's many schools.
Yes.
There's many schools that give a different weight to verbal comp versus the bio.
Yeah, the bio and the physics, all that was like, we scored really high in that. But according to the MCAT, I didn't speak English. Like the verbal aspect was tough. So I got really lucky for the verbal at that time. But I remember my scores were terrible up until that point. But it's an exam taking. It's not really knowledge based. I mean, you need to have knowledge, but you have to just be able to write exams and practice. That's what it came down to. Yeah. So, but ultimately, after I wrote the MCAT and I had a decent GPA, but it was not competitive enough for Canada, that's when I decided to apply to the Caribbean.
Yeah. So just to apply to med school, the prerequisites, like having a high GPA is like advice, sort of, right? Because you can technically go to the Caribbean. It's possible. So the prerequisites to getting into a medical school are get your prerequisites for medical school, which are all the basic sciences. Yeah. And get your letters of recommendation. I remember we had to write a personal statement. Yeah. And obviously have a competitive MCAT score. Yes. And then shoot your applications out. And that's it. Yeah. And then you can get into an MD school and then take me through MD school. And I think this is where there's a little bit of a difference between Caribbean and Canadian and American schools. Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about the Caribbean journey. How was the weather?
It was great, except for the hurricanes.
And the cockroaches.
So for me, I was looking into Caribbean med schools that had the highest rate of people coming back into Canada. So for me, the schools really that I was ranking at the time was St. George, Grenada, Ross, and then the third one, which was the one I went into, was Saba. So that was the island I went to, which is a small little Dutch island right next to St. Kitts. Not St. Kitts, sorry, St. Martin's. So that application is very similar to the application for med school in Canada. So you have your letters of recommendation, you send your transcript from undergrad, and then you kind of send them a fee, personal statements, all this kind of stuff. In general, depending on the Caribbean med school, there's lots out there. Some of them are a little bit more competitive than the others, and they're all very expensive. Some of them, for example, like my sister, she went to St. George. You can also get some relief in terms of how much the tuition costs, depending if your GPA is really high. They want to basically have people that have a high chance of becoming a successful physician. So they want to get smart people in, right? So for me, when I went to Saba, it was a great, amazing 2 years, but it was extremely intense, like very, very accelerated learning.
It's 2 years, right?
Yeah. So how it worked there is when I got to the island, we figure out where we're staying and everything. And then you kind of grow relationships with your roommates and everything. Fun time. But also I'd probably say it was the first time in my life I learned how to study. And it was very intense. Like, for example, how it was when I was doing it is when we started off, like, we had maybe 100, 125 people in our class. By the time I graduated with my same cohort, there's only about 20 to 25 of us that graduated together at the same time. So it's a very high attrition rate. Some schools have a very high attrition rate. Some schools do not. The reason for that is that you want to make sure that the top get through. And even if people don't maybe graduate at the same time, they might, take a year or a semester off and then come back through, and it's just a different cohort, right? So it is very, very, like when you're going in there, you got to just know, like, this is my focus. I'm going to become a doctor. I'm going to do this. I'll do whatever it takes. And what's great about it when I was there in the Caribbean is just that everybody has the same focus, the same zone, and everybody's there to help each other. So I love that aspect, because when you're all in the trenches together, it just motivates you further, right? Mm-hmm. So my typical day would have been like, how it would work, the structures, like one of my classes was, say, biochemistry. So to put it in perspective, how accelerated this is, biochemistry at U of T is, say, a semester, like 4 months. We would do that same stuff within a month. And that's just one course out of many courses. So you're going into class,
biochem at U of T was split into two.
So it
was a year.
So it was 8 months, right? Yeah. So we did that like basically in like a month and a half, accelerate. And that's just one course. So you're doing a lot, but it's a lot of fun, a lot of learning. So my typical day would be like, I'd go in an hour early, review the lecture slides. You're basically getting hundreds of slides a day just to prep your mind. Then you go into class, you sit and listen. I never took notes because I don't, like, some of my friends would take notes and I would take it after, but I find I'm a good auditory listener. And then afterwards, go work out at the gym. And then from there you go study and review. And then on the weekends, you kind of just re-review everything again. And then every 2 to 3 weeks, they would have an exam, which is very intense, but I liked it because they're really prepping you, like the Caribbean med school I went to, they're really prepping you more for the USMLEs, the United States Medical License Exam. At the time was based on a score system for step 1, which is a very tough examination, but now they've turned it into a pass and fail. So there's positives and negatives to that. But you're kind of going through like studying for like 2 weeks straight. And then you basically, do a bunch of practice exam questions. Thankfully, it was all multiple choice. Nothing was like written answer. And then you go into the exams, you write the exams. Then for like 2-3 days, you binge, drink, party, have a great time. Then you go back to reset mode. So you kind of do that, rinse and repeat for like 2 years.
That's not a prerequisite.
No, it's not a prerequisite. But everybody has ways of having fun. At the time, I like to indulge a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
A little bit. Hence why I had to go to the Caribbean to begin with. But yeah.
So there's quite a few differences here, actually. So in the Caribbean, it's 2 years. In North America, it's 3 years.
So no, 2 years for just the basic science training. Okay. But it's a total of 4 years.
Oh,
right?
Okay.
So I think all are 4 years. I think McMaster's 3 years. No, I think they're all 4 years. I think they're all 4 years. It's just that when do you start going into the hospital differs. I can't speak.
And they write exams during med school. So they write the USMLE step 1 at the end of, I believe, year 2.
So that's what we all do. So for us, so after the 2 years of the accelerated program or the studying, we're basically prepping in the last months before we finish our med school in the Caribbean for USMLE step 1. So they kind of go through courses. The main one's like Kaplan, and there's videos and everything. And then you're just doing practice questions. And then we have an exit exam. I think most Caribbean schools have this because they want you to write the exam like it's a version of the USMLEs to make sure you pass. So then when they say, okay, you're good to go, then go write the exam. Then in about 2 to 3 months time, then you write the step 1. So for me, after I did the 2 years, me and my buddies, three of us, we ended up staying together in Laurier under my sister's place. So we just practice for the step 1. It's really good to do it in a group setting. And every day we just grind. It's literally 12, 14 hours going to the gym, studying, writing a bunch of exam questions. And then we did that for about a month and a half. Then we wrote step 1. And then our scores at the time, they rated the scores. So thankfully, me and my buddies, we did really well. Rob Wilson and Zain Burhani. Zain shout outs. Zain's actually here. He's practicing in Scarborough as a staff, and Rob's a Palm Crit in the States. But yeah, that was a great time. But it's very competitive, and we had all extremely good scores.
Made lifelong friends.
Yeah, lifelong friends for sure. When you go through something that's that stressful, you're gonna come out with hard friendships, strong friendships. Yeah, so it was good.
All right. So we got 2 years in Sabah, then you wrote step 1,
Correct.
right? Then what are the next 2 years?
Then after that, once you pass step 1, then you're like, okay.
Actually, give me a second.
Yeah.
How'd you just disappear and study for a month somewhere?
So we were lucky. So you
Is
have
this like during med school? Like,
no.
Is this
So
a summer break?
So we don't really have, like, for where I was going, there was no real summer. You have like maybe 2 to 3 weeks off. But once you finish your 2 years, then it's up to you to decide when you write your step 1. Then it's up to you to when you want to start clinicals. You generally want to start it within a 3 to 6 month period, because every day you go without like going back into like a medical setting, you're going to start to forget stuff, right? So some people end up like delaying writing their step 1s, and then it may be a year later. And then by then you've lost a lot of the knowledge, and then you're just catching up, and it becomes even harder and harder to write the step 1, to pass it, and then go into the clinical rotations. So in general, you usually want to write it within 2 to 3 months after you graduate. It's just better because you have more knowledge than you think you do. You always know more than you think you know, especially when it's multiple choice, because subconsciously you kind of know what the right answer is.
Yeah. I don't know if everyone feels that way.
That's true. That's how I felt.
That's like if you over prepare, I think you might have that subconscious thought process. But I only say that because I saw how you studied and you were like 5x most people, right?
Yeah.
And I think that I'm only stressing that because from the Caribbean, I didn't see many people become doctors, right?
Well,
Even after coming back.
A lot of people, depending once you graduate, they do, you technically get your MD after your 4 years, but you're not a practicing physician.
Like they weren't able to land residency.
That's
right?
where it comes down to
a lot.
Yeah.
Right. Like we're talking people wrote exams over and over again, and they tried for years.
Yeah.
Right. And so the struggle from the Caribbean is high. Right. I feel
tough.
like it's almost harder because you're not the priority, right? For all American residency programs, their U.S. students are the priority, and then same thing in Canada, right? So you come after, so you have to really excel on those exams, right?
100%.
And
that was the defining. So that's why I was saying now step 1 is now pass and fail. Before it was a score based. So it's good in a sense that if you're not a good exam taker, but it's also, it sometimes hampers, say, the international medical graduates, because really that's one of the only things we can, at the time when I was doing it, it's like, hey, this is me. I actually know what's going on. Although a lot of people would argue that step 1 is kind of like, it's basic science. It's not clinical. So it doesn't determine if you're a good physician or not. It's just, do you have the foundations, right? But I would say, like, say, for example, the most important part, which you touched on, is residency, right? That's what really matters. That's what you're aiming for at the end of the day. And step 1 is what helps you get there. So residency, that's a different beast, but you do that.
We'll get there.
Yeah, we'll get there. We'll get there.
We still have to get through your. So we got to step 1, and then we the clinicals. Yeah. Right. So the clinical rotations. Yeah. Now, is this where you get to like pop into different departments and chime in like, hey, I like this, I don't like this? Is that what clinicals is kind of? And do you have that level of autonomy, or is it just no?
I mean, you don't have, I mean, you have autonomy in the sense of selecting where you want to go. Depending on what medical school you go to, there's different openings and different positions at different hospitals and different parts, for me, in the States. Yeah. So for example, like some Caribbean med schools, like St. George is the most expensive. It's the most prestigious one. They probably have more access to different hospitals in the entire US than, say, for example, the Caribbean, or sorry, not the Caribbean, Saba. But it was still, you usually want to go to, there's different types of, they call it books. There's like a green book, and I forgot the other type of book, but there's one, it's under the umbrella term of this hospital is considered residency accredited. So you want to be going to one of these residency accredited hospitals in order to do your clerkship training. So clerkship in itself is different. It's where you really become and learn about becoming a physician. And that's the most fun. So you basically start off.
And when is this?
So
the entire process.
So for me, it started off after I wrote step 1. Then I kind of organized like, okay, yes, you passed step 1. Okay, this is where you're going to go for your rotations. For me, I chose most of my rotations in Baltimore and then in New York. And the reason for that is I already heard about other people that did it there, and it was a good rotation. So I did a lot of my rotations up in Union Memorial and Harbor Hospital, and that was a fun time too. But how that works is that you basically select where you're going to go. Depending on what medical school you go to, there's different openings and different positions at different hospitals and different parts, for me, in the States. So for example, like some Caribbean med schools, like St. George is the most expensive. It's the most prestigious one. So I did a lot of my rotations up in Union Memorial and Harbor Hospital, and that was a fun time too. But how that works is that you basically select where you're going to go. Then you usually want to do your core rotations first. Once you get those out of the way, then you can start doing your electives. So core rotations goes back to internal medicine, obstetric gynecology, general surgery, psychiatry. Those are kind of the main core rotations. I might be forgetting one, but I think that's what it is off the bat. For me, this is also where you find out what kind of doctor you want to be, like what kind of field you want to go into.
So you essentially, everyone does a course.
Yes.
Like everyone has.
You have to do your course.
Okay.
And then you have to do I think you have to do up to, I can't remember how many, but it's like for 2 years, you have to basically do a rotation each month. So you have to go through all that. And the rotations, you can stack certain ones, others you don't have to. But the idea is that you have to get a filter of, or you have to rotate through all the cores. You sometimes repeat the cores if you want to get stronger than them. And then you go into your electives to see which ones you like. And then from there, you apply.
I wish they did that in law.
Yeah.
That's really annoying because
how does it work in law?
You just finish law school and then you apply for jobs, right? And I mean, we don't get much exposure to, I guess you can go in law school, you can get into mood competition, but that's not real life.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But actually, no, it's great experience. Highly recommend you do it if you do it.
Yeah.
You can get into negotiations, competitions, client interviewing. They do try to simulate that stuff, but it's not like real life experience. Like, I mean, most law students have never looked at a real contract. Right? Most law students have not seen all these different areas of law. They don't even know about areas of law.
Yeah.
Right? When you go on to a website of like any big law firm that provides tons of services, there's so many random, tiny, nuanced areas of law that even lawyers don't know about.
Yeah.
Right? And so I wish the legal profession did something to bring light to all the different options that are available for you to specialize in. But anyways, we're talking about medicine here.
Yeah.
So do you ever go back? Okay, let's get to clinical rotations first. So how long do these core rotations take?
So for example, one core rotation, I think is 8 weeks internal medicine.
So it's all done within like a year.
No,
or within like half a year.
So yeah, core rotations you could probably finish within half a year to a year.
Okay.
But it really depends on where you want to do your core rotations because some hospitals are better or well known for their training in that area. So you may want to, I'm busy this month, or they don't have any more students available for this month or slots available. Then you have to delay it for another month.
Do your relationships in rotations help you land residency?
100%.
They do.
I would say
network.
Yeah, it's very well networking. I would say you probably do that more in your 4th year, but you're already like networking by talking to people. Really, what you want to show your attending is that you are always on the ball. Even if you're not, you're learning from your mistakes. You're going out of your way for patient care. Number one is patient care. You're like always number one is patient care, making sure you're doing something safe, the patient's safe, you're safe, making sure that you're very thoughtful in terms of your workup, your thought process, what you want to do. Like for me, I found that the knowledge part was there for the basic sciences, but the clinical was not there. And that's the whole point of clerkship. So how it worked for me when I started my clerkship, I would literally be there like an hour and a half, 2 hours before even rounds started, just to round on the patients. So how it would work in clerkship, say in internal medicine, you first like meet up with everybody. They say, okay, this is your rotation. This is who you're going to be working with. So then you start off, say that was like on a Friday, then Monday you start your rotation. So Monday I would come in, if we were supposed to start at 8, I'd come in at like 6 a.m. in the morning. I would usually, the resident would also usually be there because I want to make sure that their attending is happy. Then you ask the resident, hey, what am I doing? Which patients can I see? Then they divvy up the patients, and then you kind of read about the patients. You learn about the patients. You go spend time with the patients, your physical examination. You come back, you write your own note. You come up with your own assessment and plan, even though it could be garbage. But the idea is that you're at least starting to do that. And then you kind of present your cases during rounds. So during rounds, say 8 a.m., the attending comes in. There's like, all right, let's go around on the patients. You go around. Sometimes they do bedside rounds, which is pretty cool, where you go into each patient's room, you chat with the patients, you learn some physical exam techniques from the attendings. And then from there, you come out, then you sit down, and then the rounds itself is where you chat about each case. And then that's where the attending or the resident does the teachings. And I find that that's helpful because you're learning case-based medicine. And that's, I think, the best way of learning it, because you can learn it all through just like, studying and writing exams, but really it's like you remember the patient, you remember what to do. And then that just kind of sticks to me in my mind better than say just reading from a textbook.
I mean, it's like theory versus practice.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you always learn more because the real situation manifests.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, okay. Now, I'm not entirely, I don't understand this entire clerkship concept. So let me first, I think you're a bottom-up guy. I'm a top-down guy. And right now we're having a little battle of that.
Okay.
So clinical rotations, they're supposed to be done over the course of 2 years, right? Is the entire that time clerkship?
So there's times where you have time off. It's just that you need to have a certain amount of like slots filled and you have to have checked off a certain amount of boxes. So do you need to, once you finish your rotation, it doesn't have to be back to back. If you do it back to back, you could probably finish within a year and a half, but really it depends on your school, right? So I can't tell you the exact amount, but you're not like always on rotation. Like when I was in my clerkship, I'd drive back and forth from Baltimore to Canada. Like I'd visit you guys here, right? When you were here and then you went to abroad. But it's like you would have like a rotation, then you can have some time off, or you can go back to back rotations, or you go to different states. So you drive from one state to another state, and then you start your rotations. So it all depends.
After you do your your cores,
yes.
How many electives are you required to do?
I can't tell you off the top how many, but you're basically filling up about a year and a half of rotations to 2 years of rotations.
Well, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So that's like a lot of exposure to many different areas of medicine.
100%.
So by the end of it, you can pretty much say, I really enjoy this.
Yes.
I don't like this.
Yes.
See, this is what other professions are lacking. Healthcare's got this. Nurses get that too. You guys get that too. That's awesome. Okay. So the entire purpose of the clinical rotation is to whatever you learned in med school, let's go apply it. Let's learn.
Yes.
And then after that, what happens after that? Is that when you do your step 2?
So that's a good question. So step 2, you can write it. You have to write it after your cores. You don't have to write it right away, but you can write it in between. Step 2 is really the clinical examination. It's still multiple choice, but it's very helpful to have that usually around year 3 to maybe near the mid-year 4 or at the end of year 4. The idea is that the rotations, once you're in your 4th year, it's kind of like an audition for when you're going to be applying for residency. So you don't want to be just learning. You're always learning. That's what medicine is. You're always learning. You're always practicing. That's why I love it so much. But the idea is that you want to be impressing people, right? And you want to have like a really good knowledge base. You also want to have a really good practice base. And the step 2 really helps you get there. So for every core rotation, there is an examination at the end of it. It's called the NBME, National Board Medical Examination. You want to score well on those. How do you score well on those? You're obviously doing your rotation. You're doing a bunch of multiple choice questions. There's a bunch of resources that you review at the time. And then you write that exam.
And when do you write these exams?
So you write them. So for every core rotation, you have to write a National Board Medical Examination.
Okay. And is this just for you to remain prepared? Or are these scores actually submitted somewhere?
These are scores. So it's like you get like a grade at the end of each rotation.
Yeah.
Even the electives, but you also get a grade during your clerkship rotations. That goes into your transcript. That also goes into like how you do in med school. So when you graduate, right? So that's all helpful. Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So you're always getting graded all the time. But
yikes.
Yeah, it's so you can't just go like walk in and just like, oh, I just want to learn this today. And
so having a good attending really matters.
Good attending matters, but you have to be.
You have to practice, obviously.
You have to practice. You have to be willing to.
The banter that you have with your attending would really facilitate that. That the practical understanding and help you succeed on that exam. In addition to your own prep, obviously.
Correct. Yeah. So the attending shows you more the physical exam, shows you the practical versions of clinical medicine. They can teach you a little bit about the basic sciences, but I'll be honest, now as an attending, I'm forgetting most of that. It's more the clinical aspect. Does it help if you have a good attending to write your NBME? Yes. But the reality is that it's more self-driven. You have to be writing your multiple choice exams. You got to be practicing. You got to be studying. Like there's something called the MICSAP, the Medical Knowledge. I forgot what the SAP stands for, but it's basically a book of just these multiple choice questions and you got to review it, but you're also studying. So your NBME score plays a role in your grade. Your rotation, how you do with the attending, plays a role in your grade. And that overall combination is what your grade is for that rotation. Then you do that for all your cores. You also, for electives, you don't have exams to write at the end, but it's like how you're doing with the attending, and that's how you're graded.
Oh, so those MBME or whatever,
Yes.
they're only for course.
They're only for course.
Oh, okay. All right. Wow, you guys really write a lot of exams.
Yeah.
Right?
It's a lot of
So,
and keep in mind, those exams that you write are very helpful for step 2 because that's
okay.
what your step 2
Yeah.
is what you're
so
focused
at least you're being trained for success.
Yeah.
You know? So take me through clerkship. What is that? I still don't get it.
So clerkship is where you have finished your basic science of training. And
At what point?
after your 2 years of
At school?
basic science of med school,
Okay. Yeah.
for me, it was in the Caribbean, sitting down at a desk,
Okay.
right? And for us, after you write step 1, right? You don't necessarily need to finish step 1 before you start clerkship, but I'm pretty sure you do. Things may have changed by now. It's been a while. But once you're in your clerkship, what that is just basically exposing you to different types of clinical situations and different types of clinical practice.
Isn't that what clinical rotations are?
That is what
So
clerkship is.
the rotations are under the clerkship.
Yes.
So
Clerkship is your last
however
years.
long
Yes.
that period is
Yes.
of you doing your electives and core rotations,
Mhm.
that in holistically
Is a clerkship.
is a clerkship. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'm with you. So you finished your clerkship.
Yes.
And now what do you do?
So now after you finish your clerkship, for me and from where I was from the Caribbean aspect, you're writing your step 2. So step 2 is, I believe, a 2-day examination. And in that examination, you don't need to do it back to back. You can kind of separate it, but it's long. It's like an 8-hour exam, just like step 1. It's an 8-hour examination. It was actually longer before they made it on a computer, but it's multiple choice. There's 2 parts to step 2. I think things may have changed now. There was a clinical skills component, which is separate than the multiple choice exam. So that's where you're basically going into a place where you have a bunch of rooms, and there's patients, actors, basically. Then you go into a room, there's somebody there that's marking you, saying if you're asking the right questions, doing the right physical examination, then you come over your diagnosis and plan. So that's clinical skills. And then there's the clinical knowledge. That's the multiple choice examination. So the MBMEs, the National Board Medical Examination that you do during your core rotations, helps you for your step 2 CK, right? Clinical knowledge. Your clinical skills examination, that you learn through your clerkship as you're learning from your attending. There's also different resources out there to help. But it's basically making sure that, first of all, you speak English. Second of all, you're not an asshole, and that you're doing things safely, right? Yeah. So those are kind of the main things. And most people pass that. The CK is generally easier to pass than step 1. It's just because there's more things to stick to your mind because it's clinical. It's like actually stuff that you're doing in practice.
Okay. And then, so you write your step 2, hopefully you do well.
You have to do well because really I would say step 2 is, yes, once again, you don't need to, I'm more exam focused. And there's a lot of physicians that I know that do well and they've done terrible in their exams. But in general, step 2 CK, that clinical knowledge really helps you because you could really be a lot better if you can remember off the top of your head what's going on when you see a case, as opposed to like reviewing and looking things up. Typically, you're writing this exam, the CK, like in your 4th year. And in your 4th year, I would recommend, or what I did is I took about 3 weeks off. And in that time, I'm just pumping through exams and just studying. And then in that case, that's how you kind of get better and you're very competitive with your scores. So that's what I would say would help with the clinical skills. It's helpful to have a group of people doing it together just so you can practice. There's different case scenarios. There's a lot of resources out there for that as well. But essentially, you have to do those 2 examinations. Then after those 2 examinations, once you write them and you pass them, then you're basically, once you're finished your rotations, then you're applying for residency.
But you're an MD at this point.
You're an MD once you've graduated from your medical school. So
haven't you graduated now?
So you graduate from your medical school once you've, first of all, done your step 1, did your 2 years of accelerated basic, or your 2 years of basic science training, then your 2 years of clerkship with your step 2 CK and CS, right?
With your step 2 and what?
CS. Well, step 2, which is clinical skills and clinical knowledge.
Yeah. So just step 2.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you have to finish all your rotations. Then you
But
like,
that's
and then you're basically
can you
finished.
even do your step 2 without your finishing your clinical rotations?
I believe you need to finish a certain amount, but generally speaking, I see most people finish all the rotations.
So it's not a
before they do it.
prerequisite.
I don't believe so. But I think in general, first of all, you need all your cores, but it also depends on the med school you're going to, right?
Okay.
So in general, you kind of write it after your rotations, after all your rotations.
Okay. All right. So you're a doctor. Let's recap a little bit. A lot
Yeah.
happened,
Yes.
right? So we were in undergrad and then we got our prerequisites, letters of recommendation, personal statement. Then we applied to med school. We got into med school. It was great. We had a good time. Then we did 2 years of basic medical knowledge, your foundations, you said. After that, you have to write the step 1. After that, you have to complete your clerkship, which involves a clinical rotation core and elective. For each core, you have to write those exams, which are essentially prepping you for step 2. And what happens if you fail one of those exams?
Doesn't look good on your grades. Then I think it depends on your school too. They may ask you to rewrite it or not.
Okay, so after you finish your clinical rotations, your clerkship, then you sit for your step 2. And are you going back to med school for this?
No, you're
Like
at that
after
stage.
year 1 and 2, after year 2, you're not in med school. Like technically, you don't need to be in a academic environment anymore. You're pretty much just in practice.
You're
right?
always in an academic
No,
environment.
no,
but
you know what I mean. Like an institution, right?
So no, because you can do that. You can apply from your couch. And there's various centers that do these exams.
Yeah.
There's like multiple centers.
Okay,
So
and it's all
you just
centralized.
Yeah, it's all
and so,
centralized. So somebody who's sitting next to you may be writing an entirely different examination. Like even they might be writing the MCAT, and then you're writing your step 2.
Okay,
right?
so you get your step 2, you kill it, and now you are finally treading towards like
Applications.
judgment day, because this is what's going to define whether you get into residency and land a residency program, right? And okay, take me through this.
So me being a Canadian that went to the Caribbean, that makes me an international medical graduate, right? So I finished my 4 years of training. Now it's time for applications for residency. So how it works if you're trying to get back into Canada, it varies. Every year it varies. So how it works is that you apply, and then you apply to the States, and then you apply to Canada. Now there's something called the match. This is after you've gone through your cycle of going through your interviews. The match varies in Canada because sometimes the match occurs first in Canada before it occurs in the US. But then sometimes it flips. So sometimes the match occurs first in the US before in Canada. Why does that matter? That matters because if you really want to be in Canada, and if you have the match in the US first before the Canadian match, you have to drop from the US match, right? So all that time, energy, and effort doesn't pay off, right? But if you have the Canadian match first, then that helps, because then if you don't get in, then you have the US match. So how does it work for the applications in general? So you first of all have to have letters of recommendation, at least 3 to 4 from your clerkships rotations.
Okay.
So usually for me, for instance, I loved internal medicine. That was actually the first rotation I did when I was a clerk. And I just absolutely loved it because I watched this show called House growing up, and I was like, oh, this is cool, right? But I had zero idea what a doctor was because I have nobody in my entire family. My mom's a nurse, so that's my only healthcare kind of information that I got or exposure. But I had no idea what internal medicine was. I thought a doctor was a doctor, right? But you learn that during actually clerkship. You don't really some people have families of doctors, but that's the only way I learned from it. So I loved internal medicine, and that's why I applied to it. But the reason why I applied to it is because I did a rotation there a second time after my core, and I did it in my 4th year as a clerk. And at that time, I was just impressing everybody. You basically want to be working at the level of 1 year above you. So I was trying to work at the level as a first-year resident, even though I was a 4th year. How do you do that? You just have to work really hard. You have to get in really early. You got to read up on your patients, and then you're first one there, last one to leave. That was kind of my mentality back then. But I loved it every moment.
I don't think anything's changed.
Yeah, I know it's changed. It's changed now because priorities change over time, right? But yeah. So in the applications, do you have to? In the States, there's like this online thing called ERAS. There's a whole bunch of different websites you have to go to, but really to simplify it, you're looking into programs in the States that you want to go to. that accept IMGs, right? So me being a Canadian citizen and an IMG, I'm not an American citizen, number one, and I don't have a green card holder. I'm not a green card holder either, right? Why does that matter? It matters because Canada versus the States is different in terms of an international medical graduate applying. In Canada, they have something called a parallel system. So you have your Canadian med students that apply, and then they're just competing against each other. But then they have a separate pile for international medical graduates. Yes, it's a lot less. So say, for example, at U of T for internal medicine, it's maybe like 50 or 60 spots for Canadian medical students for internal medicine. There's only 10 or 11 spots for international. So you're competing with the international medical graduates. These are people not just from the Caribbean, but they're from China, India, like from all over the world. So it's like when I was applying, maybe it was, 500 to 1,000 people for like 10 spots. So it's very competitive. It's more competitive. It's basically harder to get back into Canada when you're an IMG than it is to get into Canada if you're like a med student going into Canadian med school. Mm-hmm. But it depends on how old you are, how mature you are, how much time and energy you spent as a kid growing up, right? Obviously, for me, it was the latter. Like I was more focused during my end of my undergrad days. But going back to the principle of applications in the States. So you were
talking about how IMGs are treated differently in Canada. So you explained the Canada part. What about America?
So the US is different. The US, I think, is a serial system, so not parallel. So basically everybody is competing, right? So you have American graduates applying for American medical schools that are generally American, right? You have DOs applying for, so there's MDs, there's DOs. DOs are applying for residency positions that originally were MD positions, but now they've opened it up to DOs and MDs, right? Generally, DOs are also Americans, right? Then the third category is, so those are the first two. So DOs and MDs that are American. The other category is that if you're, say, Canadian doing American medical school, like MD or DO, then you're applying. And then the fourth, so that's four. And then the fifth category is going to be like if you're international, and then you're applying for residency.
Like an international domestic,
yeah,
which is like international students,
yes,
right, studying under U.S. institutions, and then there's like legit international.
Yeah,
they could be even U.S. students that studied abroad.
Yes,
right.
Yeah.
Okay,
so that actually adds. So yeah, if you're a U.S. student, that you go to the Caribbean and then you come back, that's a category. But at the end of the day, it's all treated the same. But really, it's not, because it's number one is Americans, right? If you're an American citizen, your scores for the steps could be way lower than like an international medical graduate, but you'll still get it, right? It's just the way it works, right? They want to protect their own. That makes sense because they pay taxes and everything. Why not, right? You're an American. Why not? The second would be the Americans or the Canadians that went to America and then applying because they had the American training. Yes, they would be preferred, right? When I was a med student applying for residency, at the time, I think it was only MDs that were doing the residency positions, but now DOs are also doing the same because they're basically trained the same. Why does that matter? It matters because that means there's really less positions for international medical graduates.
Yeah.
So it's more competitive now than it was, say, maybe 5-6 years ago, right? But it's only going to continue to be more competitive. Essentially, in a nutshell, you have to be way better in your grades, in your step scores for you to get a chance. Put it in perspective, I had over 99th percentile on my step scores. I applied to 120 places. I only got 15 interviews. So
99th percentile.
Yeah, for the step scores.
Yeah.
So it's like it's 95th percentile for step 2. And then you have to write step 3 as well. And that's like really good scores. And I only applied to internal medicine, right? So surgery is even harder, right? Like it's very hard to get back in. But once you get into residency, you're set. So you apply, then you get the acceptance for, okay, let's have an interview. And then you kind of go to the different places to have your interviews. What I liked about the US is that they kind of wine and dine you. So it's like some places actually they fly you over, which is pretty cool. So I kind of flew to a few places. I checked out the scenes. Everybody's very pleasant. It's just a very calm, chill environment. And the interviews are more relaxed. So I really love that because really they want to get the best and they want to make sure that it helps their program. So it was really cool. It was a fun time, very costly, probably like $10,000 to $20,000 spent just on applications in the US alone. So it is expensive. And then I applied to the Canadian, only in Ontario. I focused. So I applied to 4 out of the 5 there. No, I applied to all 5. So McMaster, U of T, Queen's, Western, and I'm missing one. I can't remember at the time of my head. But anyways, I got 4 out of the 5 interviews. So I didn't get McMaster. They're very much more focused on research and stuff and verbal, which, right? But they're all brilliant, right? All these guys are smart. But anyways, the Canadian interviews were very different. It's very intense, very stressful. Obviously, it's stressful because you want to get back in, but
you said that interviews are not stressful. The concept of whether you're going to land a residency spot is stressful, correct?
100%. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The interviews are just, I'm under the impression they're trying to find out, are you a normal human or a bookworm or,
So the American ones that I went to, they seemed more like, are you a regular human? Yeah. Like, can you speak?
English.
Cool. Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. Right. Like you speak English. But the Canadian ones, like some of the interviews, like they were actually asking like, like really they're ethical questions they ask, but then they're also like, I remember one of the places I went into, I sat down and there's like a prescription there. Like, oh, tell me what's wrong with this. What's going on with this? What's this clinical scenario like? And then others were kind of like, oh, we saw your resume. We saw your scores. You did really well. Tell me more about yourself. So it can be variable. It's very hard. But I would say the Canadian ones were a little bit more, they're way more challenging, more professional. I would say the US ones was more kind of laid back and relaxed.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So you land, you have some good interviews, you wine and dine, and then you get residency.
Yeah.
Right. And now I know, because I already interviewed before, residency varies between 3 and 7 years, 8 years.
2.
What's the shortest?
Family med.
I thought that was 3.
2 years. They're thinking of making it 3 years, but there's no point.
Okay, so 2 and 8 years.
Yeah, it could be even longer than 8 years, but yeah.
How long?
It could be long. It can be very long. It depends how much like subspecialties you want to do, but it can be very long.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you start getting paid more, right, towards the end?
So yeah, we could talk about payment after. But,
okay.
Yeah.
All right. So when do you write step 3?
Great question. So step 3, what I did, because I was applying to Canada as well as the States, I wrote step 3 after my 4 years. But I wrote step 3, and step 3 is also a 2-day examination as well, but it's 2 days of multiple choice questions. I wrote that, and then within 2 weeks, I wrote the Canadian examination. So there's 2 Canadian examinations. Actually, there was 3 at the time, but I only wrote, right now, I think they dropped one of them. So one was called, so there's 2 Canadian exams. One's called the MCCQE1, then the MCCQE2. I think it stands for Medical College Council Examination Equivalency, something like that. So that's 1 and 2 that all Canadians have to write after their 4 years to get their MD. And then the part 2 is like kind of similar to the clinical skills examination, which we do in step 2. So you go in and then you kind of talk to people and then you kind of do a history, physical examination, differential diagnosis. So that's MCC part 1, part 2. And then there was something called the MCCEE, which they dropped now, I think, in Canada. But that was what helped me. That's basically a multiple choice examination for internationals coming back into Canada. And that one I got destroyed that one. So
as in did well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's because I wrote step 3 2 weeks before. So I would actually say the Canadian examinations are actually easy. It's the clinical skills that are hard. It's the American examinations that are very tough. The reason why I could say that is I know a lot of my colleagues and friends, if they were to write the USMLE, they would fail. But the Canadian version of it, very easy. But that doesn't mean, so an examination doesn't mean anything. It's just something, a step for the next component.
Yeah.
So,
well, we need more doctors in Canada, so it's good that they keep it at that standard.
Yeah.
Okay. So step 3, I believe you have to write your step 3 in order to get your license.
So step 3,
a prerequisite to your MD license to practice post-residency, that's a prerequisite.
From my understanding, yes.
Okay. All right.
But I also, yes. But I also know sometimes programs could accept physicians to be, and if they're writing their step 3, like right at the beginning. But in general, yes, you need your step 3.
Man, just learning about being a doctor is so hard. What a tough profession. Okay.
Every profession's tough, bro.
No, it's not. No.
It's
like medicine is probably one of the most difficult professions, period. More people fail becoming doctors than any other profession. The hardest school to get into is veterinarian school, right? But that's just number of schools.
Just like
right?
dentistry. There's not a lot of dentistry schools.
Yeah.
There's not like, there's actually, it's more competitive than
but
MD in Canada.
It's crazy, man. Becoming a doctor is hell. So let's at least recap everything a little bit quicker.
Yeah.
Undergrad, then you do your step one right after you get into med school. You do your clinical rotations. After that, you write your step two.
Sorry. Go back. So you write your step. You have to start off med school, then you write your step one. You don't do step one before.
So you do your undergrad,
Yeah.
then you get into med school. After you do your MCAT and all the stuff we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
Then once you're in med school, 2 years of basic knowledge. Then you write your step one. Then you do your clerkship. Then you write your step two. Kill everything. Based on that, you get interviews for residency. And so what is the matching process, by the way?
So
let's talk about that right after.
Yeah.
Right. So after step two, then you do the interviews, then you land residency. Somewhere before finishing residency, you have to do your step three, and then you get your MD license. Right. Now, before we move forward, I want to know, what is this match? Is this like dating for doctors or something? And second, I want to talk a lot about residency and tips you would give to other people that are going through residency, because it is a horrendous time in every doctor's life.
It's a beautiful time. It's one of the most stressful times.
So let's talk about match first.
Yeah. So the match, how it works in Canada and the US from when I was doing it, is that you have a ranking system. So wherever you've applied, you've had your interviews, then you have these websites that you basically go on, and then you kind of rank where you want to be. So for example, in Ontario, it's like, okay, I ranked UFT number one, say Western number two. So I kind of go down that list, and then you rank it that way. In the US, same idea. So you have, all right, I had like say 12 interviews. So I ranked the 12, and like number one is the one that I really want to go into, then 12 being the least. But at the end of the day, you're just happy getting into residency. And then you essentially wait. And while you're waiting at that time, actually, I do remember I was waiting while I was in Detroit with my sister, and I was studying for step three at that time. So that was stressful. But it's basically how the algorithm works, from my understanding, is that it's the school selects you, and then it kind of just goes through something, and then it figures out this is where you matched. I don't know the details of that, but that's basically, you rank it the way you want it. Some people match.
It is like the dating process, you know?
Yeah. But it's also, if you have a couples match, it's a little different. So if you're matching with, say, your partner, like my cousin went through that. Shout out Vishal Sharma. But that's like, you basically select the places where they'll do a cohort match, like the two of you together, a couples match, so not cohort. And couples? Then, couples match. So basically you and your partner have to select the exact same ranking and everything like that. So,
wow.
Yeah.
That's cool.
It's cool. But that's a very stressful time. And then, so what happens is, if you don't match, there's something called the scramble. That is essentially, you then, and I never went through this, so I don't know, but this is what I've heard. You basically, there's positions that are not filled. And if positions are not filled in residency, that's ridiculous. So then there's like an email sent out, and then people kind of say, oh, shucks, okay, maybe I should do this. So then they kind of change what they may even want to change their specialty. Ooh. Just to like say, all right, I didn't match into this, let me just match into this. So for example, in general, like there's not enough family doctors in Canada or the States. So usually there's positions that are not filled for family doctors in the States. So people who apply, say, for internal medicine is primary care in the States. It's very similar to family medicine, just a little, there's some differences and nuances. But if you don't get into internal medicine, then you say, all right, I'm going to do maybe family medicine. And then they might be able, so the scrambles where they then do a second iteration of the match, and then you match at that point. But in general, I would say in Canada, it's over 90 to 95% of people match, Canadians match, right? Okay. So people still don't match. In the States, as an IMG, it's like 30, 40% of people match. The other 60%, like 50, 60% don't. So matching that's where it comes down to. That's the stress. That's really what matters.
Everything sounds stress. At different stages, you have a different stress, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure when you were writing your step 1, you were like, oh my God, what are my grades?
Yeah.
And then obviously same thing with step 2.
Mm-hmm.
I think step 3 doesn't sound that stressful because you should know your stuff by then.
You should know your stuff, but also it's like kind of reaffirming what you learned, and it just feels good because you know what's going on. There's more statistics in that one, but it was a fun exam. The thing is, I never liked studying, but then I learned to love it in med school, and then I loved it ever since.
After your step 3, and you're done your residency, do you have to write any more exams, or is there like a licensing exam or something?
Yes. So that's different. So after you match into your residency position, now I can only speak to the Canadian side because I don't know what it is in the US, but I'm pretty sure it's similar. So for me, when I matched into internal medicine, there you start off residency, and for me, it was 4 years. The first 3 months as an international medical graduate, there's something called a PEEP. What does that mean? It basically means that you're under probation. In case you screw up or mess up or anything, you can be kicked out of the program. It almost never happens, but that's an extra added stress.
What's a screw up?
Like,
is it like ethical?
Oh,
or
ethical for sure is probably number one for don't do crazy, stupid
is it like
shit.
medical mistakes?
Medical mistakes will always happen. That's why it's called practice. But if it's like outrageous mistakes, like then you're like, okay,
give me an example of an outrageous
like an outrageous mistake is somebody comes in hypotensive and like they're in septic shock and like they're like dying, and instead of giving them fluids, you give them let's give them a blood pressure medication to lower their blood pressure. That's just outrageous and stupid. Nobody would ever do that, but that's just like, whoa, you're just trying to kill this person.
A
right?
week 1
nobody
resident
would do that.
would not do that.
Nobody would do that. But it's usually more ethical stuff.
See,
right?
like I don't understand that example. Like, I mean,
So for example,
you don't have to explain that to me.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying, everyone who's got into residency should know that.
Yeah.
And you have to be a complete moron.
Yeah.
Okay.
But in general, it's not because of
or something like that.
It's usually ethical. And generally, if somebody makes medical mistakes that are very outrageous, it's not because of their medical knowledge at that stage. It's usually there's some other stress in their life.
Yeah.
There's like something else going on in their life that's making them think this way, or they're not thinking at all.
Okay.
Right?
So
like,
after the 3 months, they're just like everybody else. What is residency?
Residency is a beast. It's what makes you who you are as an attending, I believe. I bet you're already learning as an attending afterwards too. But residency is basically you're getting paid as an MD. You're able to prescribe, but under an attending supervision, and it's essentially
you get paid as an MD.
Yeah,
like
you're
the
getting
amount,
paid, but the amount is probably equivalent to $5, $6 an hour.
So you're not getting paid as an MD.
That's just the amount of hours you work, right?
Yeah.
So it's basically where you're really ramping up and learning your specialty.
Okay.
So in internal medicine, for me, it was the first 2 months was internal medicine, and then I think 1 month of endocrinology. But the added stress of being an international medical graduate is that the Canadian training I find is exceptional. I mean, same with the States and everything, but like their clinical skills are on another level. Like they're just so good in terms of like their physical exam. They're kind of bringing everything together and summarizing it in a very coherent way. Up until this point, before I became a resident, I was great with my knowledge. I'm like, oh yeah, multiple choice off the top, I'll rip anybody, right? But the reality is that when you're actually faced with a patient in front of you, they're not going to have multiple choice down their forehead, be like, all right, this is what you do. Like, it's like you learn those skills. You learn it a bit in clerkship, but really you learn it in residency. And for me, that was the biggest struggle because at the beginning I had like imposter syndrome. Like, what am I doing here? I don't know what the hell's going on. But you learn very quickly. You learn a lot and you have a lot of support. But it was very, very tough at the beginning. Like how it would usually typically work for internal medicine ward, you would start off in the day, the attendings would break out the list, or you would usually have a senior. So there's a junior and a senior would be like R2 or R3. R2 meaning residency, are like second year or third year, right? They would kind of be the quote unquote senior that kind of distributes the list and then says, okay, these are the patients you're going to see today. And then you just go around and see them, write your assessments and plans, order what you got to order, replace the electrolytes you got to replace. Then you go sit down. there's rounds for teachings, and then you kind of talk through the cases. And then at that stage, you're learning, but at the same time, you're managing patients. And you're doing it basically on your own with the supervision of a staff. And that's how you become like independent with practice. For me, it was very stressful the first couple of months, but I was very lucky to be in a great hospital environment and a lot of support, but extremely stressful.
I mean, how many hours are you working?
60 to 80 hours.
A week?
Yeah. Like internal medicine, we did Q3, Q4 call. So every 3 to 4 days, you do like a 28 hour call. It's really 24, but you're there later. The reality is that there's now these checks in wellness where it's like, okay, you have to go home at this time and this date. But for me, being an IMG, coming into the program, it's like, yes, sleep is important, but I need to understand this. I need to learn this. And then you'd be there early and you'd be there late, just learning. But over time, the more you're exposed, the better you get, the faster you get. And it just helps. But at the beginning, yeah, like probably 60, 80 hours easily. Yeah. Like some weeks, it depends on what program. Like if you're not in general internal medicine, then you could be doing, like if you're in like endocrine, it's way less hours because it's more clinic based, but there's also the hospital basis too. So every specialty has its pluses and minuses. When I did my endocrine, that was a great time. Like I had more time, but then you're also like doing presentations, like you have to organize these things. So there's all these things on the side that you're always working on. And then you're also trying to start to do research as well, like real research, because now you have the MD, now you're a resident. So people are going to take you more seriously about if you want to do research. So there's all these things that you're doing, but it's very busy.
I mean, 80 hours is an unbelievable standard.
Yeah.
Like, how do you fill that in?
It's just so,
Like,
for example,
how many shifts do you have?
So it's like, for example, if I were saying a week of internal medicine, like you just say Monday to Friday, but then you may be working the weekends, but then there might be like, say if you're doing a call night, so you'd be there in the morning, do your rounding. So it's like 8 a.m. till like say 3, 4 p.m. Then 4 or 5 p.m. you're basically in the hospital until 8 or 9 a.m. the next day, getting calls from the ward from all your patients, going downstairs to the emerge. The senior resident would kind of say, hey, this is your patient, come see him, assess them, admit them, or send them home, discharge them. So you're kind of doing that. And then you're intermittently going upstairs, maybe taking a nap, but then you're getting a page every like 10, 20 minutes. So you're not getting sleep. Some people do get sleep, but you're not really getting sleep. And then like you're getting calls for Tylenol. I remember the first time my first page was Tylenol order. I'm like, oh shit, am I ordering this the right way? Like it's just, it's very interesting. But then you learn the flow of it. So then you say start off at 8 a.m. You basically finish around 9 a.m. But really you're doing rounds, chatting, tidying up stuff, sending referrals, whatever. You get home by
You start at 8 and you finish at 9 the next day.
Yeah, but that's only for the call nights, right? If you're not on the call night, you're just doing your regular 8 to 5 or 8 to 6 or 8 to 4, 8 to 5. Depends on the hospital you're at. But then you're going home, reviewing stuff, maybe adjusting your notes, whatever. So it can be very busy. Like it could be up to 80 hours a week. Sometimes it's less. Sometimes like 40 hours, 30 hours. Like it really depends. But on average, I would say
during residency?
Yeah. It really depends on which area you're in. So yeah, like
that's what, when I was talking to Dr. Gray, he said his residency wasn't crazy like that. So I guess neurology is a little bit more chill in comparison.
Well, they probably have their call nights too for say stroke call. But in general, like when you're in that subspecialty, it's usually like a 9 to 5, right? But internal medicine, you're basically the main person in the hospital.
Internal medicine seems like hell, man.
It's so much fun because like I feel like once you go into a specialty, you're just like kind of pigeonholed into one area, and some people love that. But general internal medicine is you manage everything, like any adult medicine wise. What I love about it so much is that you really are the only ones that can ask for help if you need it. In general, what I've been told by a great attending was that internal medicine should be able to manage everything. You should only get the subspecialist to help with procedures. That's how much I love internal medicine. But it gets to a stage where you're too tired, you're too busy, you're not able to do everything, think everything through. You may not be as comfortable in giving certain therapies, and that's why you get the subspecialists to be involved.
I've always thought that if anyone's working for 24 hours, I don't want them tending to me any time after hour like 12 to 24, like, which is crazy.
It's actually a good point that you bring up. Actually, I think they've done studies on this. I can't remember, but I remember an attending was telling me this. The more complicated something is, your mind is actually still able to think about it. If it's mundane things, like very simple things, then you'll mess up. Like, for example, driving home. after a call night. That's a very simple task to do, but that's where accidents occur, right? Yeah. Simple like regurgitation of information. You can mess up that stuff. But the more complicated or the sicker the patient is, technically you generally, it's not advised, but you're still able to still do it. You could still critically think. Yes, it's going to go down, but you're not going to substantially drop, right?
But is that the standard? I mean, like not everyone that comes to the hospital is a complicated situation.
Yeah.
Right. I'm sure there's people that think they have a massive issue, but it's actually not a big deal at all.
Yeah.
And then essentially what you're saying is for them, there's a likelihood of mistake. They might make a situation worse.
Yeah. Well, so put it in perspective, Sheikh, is that it's the beauty of residency is that you're not the only one.
Thank God.
You have, so when a patient comes in, let's say in the emerge, they first see the nurse, the triage, then they see the emerge doc. And generally, the emerge docs are staff. Then after they see them, they're referred to medicine. Then we have a senior resident who reviews them, screens them, then has the internal medicine like PGY1, PGY2 that then sees the patient. Then they're reassessed overnight. Then the next day in the morning, they are also reassessed. Overnight, there's also ICU that's in-house. There's also attendings that come in if there's really complicated issues. I remember an attending came in just to do a lumbar puncture in a patient who had presumed meningitis, but the resident, the staff couldn't get it in. So the attending literally drove down, came in, did the lumbar puncture, and then like left. And then got that. And then patients that are crashing or getting really sick, you have the ICU that's there. So there's so many layers of protection. Things still get through, right? Things still happen, but that's why you have quality improvement and you learn from it. And to be honest, it's the nurses that really are the most helpful for healthcare because they're the eyes and ears for the physicians. They're the ones that are like, hey, there's something not looking right. So as like a resident, when a nurse says, hey, there's something going wrong, there's something going wrong because nurses know. They have like their experience, especially their experience, they know exactly what's going on. But that's why it's very important and it's teamwork. It's all about teamwork. So yes, things always fall through the cracks. They actually said there's this quote that's not real. I think they've debunked it, but they said in July, that's where most deaths happen because that's when residency starts. But it's not true. It's the same. It's the same throughout. So it's not a true statement.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So, all right, we spent a lot of time talking about this.
Mm-hmm.
You finish your residency and then you write a licensing exam and you're a doctor.
Yes.
Like
so
after that, is there more exams?
So after your internal medicine, so after the 4 years, you have something called the ABIM.
Oh my gosh.
That's for your fellowship, right? Okay. So your fellowship is basically your area of training. So my fellowship in internal medicine, you write this exam that credentials you as an internist, general internal medicine. That examination is actually, it's a good exam, but you do need to be up to date with a lot of stuff. It's the Americans do something similar. So they have ABIM there. Sorry, for us, it's not ABIM. It's called the Royal College of Physicians Internal Medicine exam. There's one for every specialty. In the States, it's called the ABIM. So in Canada, you have to write it and pass it before you start practicing your general trait. I heard, but I'm not confirming, that I think you finish your residency in the States for, say, general internal medicine. You could write the ABIM afterwards, but you can still technically practice. But it's not the same. Like, it's better when you have that credentialing, right?
Dr. Gray did mention that you have to write a licensing exam.
Yes.
So I'm guessing that's that.
So the ABIM. So
okay. Yeah. So it makes sense. And that's after the fellowship.
That's
right?
after the fellowship.
And then now you're a full-fledged doctor.
Yeah.
Like you were a doctor technically when you got your MD, but you're a practicing doctor. Is there a different distinction, a physician?
Well, no, it's all because there's doctors of everything, right? So I say physician, right?
I mean, they should make a distinction between a doctor and somebody that can practice if they're both the same terms. Like,
well, yeah, they're all, it's true.
I guess it's a resident fellow doctor.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, cool.
Well, attending. You could say attending. That's like the...
Okay.
Yeah. Staff.
And once you become a doctor, you can technically only practice where you get a license, right?
So for Ontario, yes. So I could practice anywhere in Ontario because Ontario credentials.
It's the same thing I believe in America. It's a state to state, but it's not like you have to write an exam. You just apply for a license. You just apply.
Exactly.
And
for the provinces.
It's just like paperwork rather than actual more exams, which you guys are very comfortable doing.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever gotten that much information about the entire process of becoming a doctor. That was a lot, man.
Yeah. We'll cut out some parts.
No, not at all. I mean, that's great. I'm sure somebody that's listening would appreciate that level of detail. I'm not cutting that out. But to become a successful doctor, now that you've been one for a minute, what type of characteristics do you need?
I can only speak for myself and what I see from my colleagues, but I think number one is be passionate, love what you do. There's a lot of people I know that don't love what they do and then they get burnt out very quickly, but you got to be passionate. You got to love it. I love it. Like up until now, it's a quote that my mom always told me. It's like, you never work a day in your life if you love what you do. Yes, it's very like, oh, everybody says that, but it's real. So be passionate about it. Be willing to take criticism and learn from it. You cannot always be right. You have to be able to communicate with teams and be okay in a team setting. That's very important. Like, especially when it comes down to like, speaking to allied health or patient care coordinator, other staff from different subspecialties. You have to be collegial, respectful. I think all that is very important. And just be a human being. Like you're dealing with people at their lowest points in their life and they're very vulnerable. And it's a lot of respect that we get for this, for helping them and making sure that they're in their worst position ever. You want to make them feel better as much as you can and try to do your best you can to either save their life, prolong their life, or if they are, very sick, allow them to have a dignified death. So it's a lot of, family dynamics, being able to speak to families. It's not just the patient. Like the medicine was always there. The medicine is fun. It's great, but that's a small part of being a physician. It's about the communications and talking to people, really. And a lot of paperwork that you just got to get over that.
But that's not a characteristic.
Yeah,
that's
not a characteristic.
Mundane aspect of the job, which everyone in the world
that's
hates.
True. Yeah.
Okay, so passion.
Yeah.
Need to be able to accept criticism. Need to work in a team environment, respectful, be a human. I wonder how we would say that.
A kind human.
Have some compassion.
You have to be compassionate. I mean, you don't have to be, but it just helps. It helps because people can feel your vibes.
That's true.
Right?
So, I remember there's some doctor show where the guy's not compassionate at all.
Yeah.
I forget which one, but he's cool. Communication skills. Obviously, that makes sense. You know what you guys should work on? No. Writing skills. Learning how to write. Well, doctors have the worst writing I've ever seen in my life. I used to practice personal injury and I saw doctors' notes all the time. I was like, what gibberish is this? But
they fix that though.
What, you dictate now?
Dictate. Or type notes.
Thank God. What type of person would hate this job, or what type of personality traits do not suit this field of work? And I can tell you one.
Yeah.
Right? Even though I'm not a doctor, I know why I left. If you're doing this because your parents told you, don't do it because you're not going to last.
Yeah.
Right?
100%.
This is an insane profession that requires passion.
Yes.
Right? And so what other types of person and personality traits do not suit this field of work?
I mean, probably more common on the opposite of that, but I would say, people who generally don't like speaking to people, communicating with people. I mean, there's fields like, for example, pathology or radiology where you don't need to really be in front of a patient. But in general, if people are doing it for the reasons of making money, because you don't make money, not in the first 10 years, you're like losing out. So don't do it for money. That's number one. People who are like very cocky, very arrogant, because you'll be quickly like dismissed. People that are, they're looking for easy way out. Like this is not an easy way. Basically, you can't be an asshole. I mean, you can be an asshole and still do well, but like you got to love what you do to a certain extent. But I would say the main characteristics is someone who is just a greedy, selfish person shouldn't be going into this. But I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know, really. I feel like anybody could do anything as long as they put their mind and heart to it, and if they have the opportunity.
I think the question is not because I'm sure there's greedy. Yeah. I'm sure there's people that do it for the money.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a lot of selfish people that are in the field of medicine as well, just like in any profession. Not singling out doctors, but this question is more supposed to be like, if you're a kid, right? You have particular characteristics, right? if I have these particular characteristics,
Yeah.
should I go into this field or should I not go into this field? Right. So I'm guessing those are the circumstances kind of ostracize you or kick you out of consideration in terms of becoming a doctor, but you can still become a doctor and find out the hard way. Right.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I was going with this.
I see.
And it makes sense. Like, if empathetic, if you don't know how to speak to other people, sure, you can find, like, I remember I was interviewing Dr. Shanna Akers, episode 5 nurse.
Yeah.
And she was telling me that even if you're introverted, right, because it's such a team environment thing for them as well, right? There's still research and there's other areas where, you know, you can find success in the profession.
Yes.
So all of that exists, but I'm just trying to create a conducive environment, right? And so it seems like if you're just doing it for the money, if you're not passionate about this, you don't know how to talk to other people, you're kind of mean and selfish. Because if you're selfish, you really don't care about patient care, right? You care about you, yourself, and I. And so it kind of makes sense that those characteristics would not suit the field of medicine.
I would say that, like, I think, you know, humans are humans. There's different characteristics. Everybody's different, but you're not stuck to those characteristics as you are as a kid. Like, I was a very different kid than I am now. I still always had the same passions, but I think you learn to grow and you become different. Like, people are constantly changing. Like, I believe in that. And I think you can't really say, oh, you can't do this because this is your characteristic. I don't believe that. But, you know, I would just say the people that would want to do it would be, you know, who would find it difficult to do it, as if they don't want to follow through with stuff. If they're not someone, if they like to take the easy way out, those are kind of those things. I mean, you could be selfish, you could be an asshole, you can be all these things and still become a great physician. But in general, it's just, going
to be a good physician
if you want to take the easy
way out.
Yeah. And it's not about just being the physician. It's about the life balance of everything outside of that. And, like, you know, people just hate it. Like, now there's such a burnout of clinicians because of everything that's been going on. And it's not because they weren't passionate about it. It's just there's a lot of other stresses that are going on in the world. So, you know, you got to be able to be thick-skinned. Like, if you're someone who's very, like, thin-skinned, then you may not work. But yeah, I guess
not a profession for butterflies. Yeah. All right. Okay. So your specialty is internal medicine, right? What's a normal day like for you? So when I asked that, you kind of already took me through, you know, you get there and then there's rounds and things of that nature. What I'm looking for is, what tasks does an internal medicine doctor perform? And take me through, like, a day.
Okay. So breaking it down, like, for me, what I do three things. So I do medical ward, I do the medical urgent care clinic, which is like a clinic, and then I also do emergency department. So out of those three, there are three different things. So, for example, for the clinic, so we have a clinic at our hospital. So how it works is that you usually have about 12 to 14 patients that are scheduled for you. Some are new consults, some are not. They're referred by other physicians, by usually the emergency department physicians, but also from the community. And what I used to do, but I don't do it anymore, is I would used to review the cases, maybe write a note the day before, just kind of pre-record stuff, because 90% of what we're doing is just dictation and notes and like paperwork. But so I would have an idea, and I'd generally already have a plan. And then, you know, you go in, then the patients come in, you go see them, you chat with them, history, physical examination, then you come up with assessment and plan, have follow-ups or not. You do that for, say, the 12 to 15 patients, right? So that's the clinic day, right? That's what a typical day is like. And then
so you see 12 to 15 patients over the course of a day.
Yeah.
And how
which
long
is pretty
is this day
chill.
like? What,
which
12?
is it's pretty chill compared to other clinics.
8 hours?
So it starts between 8:30 or 9 until 3:30. So usually I don't like to take lunch. I just go straight. So I just add in another patient. And then after that, I finish the day. And then whatever referrals I need to send off, I do that. And
What's a referral?
A referral is like basically, okay, this patient
Handing
comes
it down
in.
to the next?
Yeah. So a patient comes in and then I say diagnose them with, say, rheumatoid arthritis, which is like stiffness of the hands, and then they need to be on medications. Being a general internal medicine doc, I can manage this, but in general, I don't follow patients long-term. Because I don't follow them long-term, I want to connect them to the right specialty, right? So I basically would refer them to, say, to a rheumatologist, right?
Okay.
And so any subspecialty, they generally have like lasting patients for years. What I personally love about general internal medicine, we don't follow patients long-term. Some of us can choose to do that, if they open up their own clinics. But in general, we're more like urgent care. So we see them once or twice. We make the diagnosis. I like to say we're diagnosticians. So we make the diagnosis, we can do some management, and then we kind of refer them to a subspecialist or send them back to their family doctor, say, hey, this is what we'd recommend, and then follow up with that.
Okay, so something popped into my head.
Yeah.
How you said in advance of seeing the patient, you look at their notes.
Yeah.
How does that happen? If you see them in an urgent capacity,
Yeah.
how do you have these notes in advance?
In terms of Ontario, there could be better, but Ontario and in terms of the hospital system, if a patient has been to a hospital in Ontario, there's usually a note that's up on something called Connecting Ontario, and you're able to pull that up. If they're over the age of 65, you're able to look up all their medications. So most of the time, most of the patients we see, our average age of a patient's like 75, 80 years old. So they're not young. They're not spring chickens. So generally they have some medical issues. And so you kind of review all that. You're reviewing the blood work because anytime they get blood work, if it's done in Ontario, you can usually pull it up. So when patients come in, they're like, oh, how do you know I have all this information? It's like, yeah, because I've been able to look at all of this. Most of the times I don't really ask their medications or like ask them their medical history, but most of the times you don't need to. You just go with the root issue because you already have everything else there.
So essentially, before you even come for your shift, right? You kind of have an idea of the panel of patients.
Yes.
If it's a clinical day.
Yes.
Right. And so you look
yeah.
at them quickly
Yes.
and then you have a rough idea.
Yeah.
Then you actually go see it via the personal,
Yeah.
the physical examination, whether anything actually is different
Yes.
from the notes that you made in advance. You
Yeah.
tend to that patient,
Yes.
either refer them or perform something to make them feel better,
Yeah.
and or prescribe them medication, send them off
Yeah.
to either another specialty or pharmacy, or hopefully you can fix them yourself.
Yeah.
And okay, that's a clinical day.
Yes.
You said there were two other types.
Yeah. But going back to the clinical day, now, because I've done it for 4 or 5 years, I can just go in and just review it right away and already know what's going on. Like it's just through time and experience. Sometimes complicated patients take a while, sometimes they don't. So it depends. So that's a clinic day. Now a ward day. The ward I find is the hardest out of all of them. So medical wards is like where a patient's admitted into the hospital, then they go to say a certain section. And then generally it's either internal medicine, so internists, or hospitalists, which are family medicine plus 1 extra year of training. They are managing the medical ward. And there you have a team approach. So your team is with an allied health team, which is basically a physiotherapist, occupational therapist, speech language pathologist, dietitian, and then you have something called a patient care coordinator, the PCC, who are just excellent at just organizing stuff and getting patients discharged. The reality in Ontario and most of Canada, it's different in the States, is that we just don't have enough beds. Most patients, not most, there's like a percentage of patients that don't necessarily need to be in hospital. They're just there because there's nowhere safe for them to go. That's why we need more long-term care facilities and all that kind of stuff. So the idea is that we're just getting patients there, managing their acute medical issues, and then I would say, hey, they're medically discharged, but they may not be able to be medically discharged if they're still weak. If you're lying in bed for a day, you're losing about 1% of your muscle mass. So imagine like an 80-year-old or 90-year-old comes in with, say, COVID. They're weak. They're not on oxygen. They're hemodynamically stable. Their blood work is fine. There's nothing I'm doing for them. But I'm like, okay, this patient is medically cleared, but they can't go anywhere because they can barely move because they're just weak, right? So the patient care coordinator, the allied health, they really help with all that, right? From the medical aspect of things, you're kind of going in. On a typical ward, you'd have between 20 to 30 patients. On a weekend, if you're doing weekend rounding, you can have up to like 60 patients. So that's like crazy. You're just putting out fires. But on a medical ward day, you're kind of reviewing all the patients. You go in, see all the patients. You go sit down for like 6 to 8 hours. You write notes, and then you're basically calling families and updating them. That's like a typical day. You do that from Monday to Friday, 8 to 6. Usually as you go on throughout the week, it becomes easier and faster because you know your patients. We're lucky enough, depending what floor you're on, you have a fast turnover. So you're discharging a lot of patients, getting a lot of new patients all the time. So it really depends.
So do you do like a ward a week, then clinical a week?
No. So it's like maybe clinic like 3 to 4 times a month for myself. Some people do it more, some people do it less. And then sometimes medical wards like 1 to 2 weeks a month. I personally don't like the medical ward as much, but everybody's got to do what you got to do because, I mean, there's some sick patients there, but in general, I like to be the one making more of the diagnosis and the management and more the acute medicine, acute medicine. But there's a lot of acute stuff in the medical ward. So in general, medical ward is a lot of general internal medicine, but it's also liaising a lot with the subspecialists that are, say, following patients.
Okay, and what's number 3?
Number 3 is the emergency department, which I love the most. That is also the most lucrative. But basically in the emerge, I either do days or nights. So days between 8 to 6. And there you're also in charge of all the code blues in the hospital. And then nights are from 6 to 8, but really it's a little bit longer than that. It's just like 5 to 8. So what you're doing on a medical emergency department, say in the daytime, you're coming into the hospital, and then how it usually typically works is the emerge physician consults you. So we get consults, and then based on the consults, we see them. Depending on their acuity, they're triaged accordingly. So if you have a patient that comes in with a fall, medically stable, even though they came in at, say, 2 p.m., and I'm referred the patient at 3 p.m., if I get a patient at, say, 5 p.m. that's crashing, I'm going to see that crashing patient first. So that patient that's medically stable, very stable, they can wait 12 to 14 hours. They see an emerge doc, right? But the idea is that I'm also not just ignoring them. We're typically putting in blood work, reviewing stuff, writing their notes before I go see them. So they may see like, oh, nothing's happening, but sometimes things are happening. You're just reviewing stuff. But in general, it's basically a triage system. The sicker you are, the faster you'll be seen. Otherwise, it could be a while. It could definitely be a while to be seen.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And so that's the emerge in the daytime. And then in the evening, that's where it's a lot more fun, but it's also more stressful. In the nighttime, basically at our hospital, there's one internist on, there's an intensivist, so an ICU doc that are typically on overnight. And then we have an emerge doc on. There's usually one anesthesia in house, and there's usually an OB-GYN in house. So there's basically 4 or 5 physicians in the entire hospital, usually 300 to 500 patients, right? So out of that, the emerge is still sending me referrals. I'm still seeing patients, but I'm also getting pages from the ward. So 80 to 90% of the patients are internal medicine. The other 10% are like, say, psychiatry, general surgery, but the rest are usually medicine, right? And even if they're not medicine, they still page us because we generally know how to manage most things overnight that are like, putting out fires, making sure patients are safe. So you get disturbed every like 2-3 minutes. So you're getting disturbed every 3 to 5 minutes on top of sitting down, reviewing a consult and doing that. So in general, extremely busy nights, and then code blues all the time. So it's very busy.
Code blue is cardiac arrest, right?
It should be only cardiac arrest, but it's not. It's also if somebody's really acutely declining and they need like an ICU level of management, say if their blood pressure is very low or they need to be put on a machine, or if they have a cardiac arrest or if their heart stops. So, but sometimes we call them as a pre-code just to get the resources there. So that's getting like the crash cart there, that's getting the nursing staff there, that's getting like sometimes the ICU comes by, but usually we're the ones that manage the code blues. And then afterwards, if the patient is sick, we revive them, they're alive. Then we kind of connect them to the ICU. Then we give handover to the ICU. We like talk it through. But sometimes they don't survive, but that's the reality, right? But in general, yeah, we try our best to make sure that we do the best we can. But yeah, it's fun. It's a lot of fun. It's very stressful, but personally, for me, I do well in very acute situations. Like you're kind of zoned in, and I love that.
I think you have the personality for it.
Yeah. Some personalities don't. Some people don't like that.
I mean, it's like a recipe for complete disaster. Like I think if
organized
somebody,
chaos.
I mean, if somebody is not passionate and loves exactly what they're doing, it's a recipe to crumble a soul.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, nonstop being pinged about stuff. You probably have to remember like your patients, and it's like,
I would say it's easier now than it probably was back in the day, because back in the day it was more paper charts, but also back in the day it wasn't as much patient volume, and they weren't as sick, and they weren't as complicated, weren't as many medications available. So now they're like way more complicated. People are living longer. They have more comorbidities. They're a lot sicker, but there's also more management strategies we have. So it helps, but patients are like, it's fun because like you're spending time, you're helping patients, you're making them feel better, you're supporting the family, and then you're also learning. You're always constantly learning. Like I'm always looking up on stuff. Like even though I've went through all my training, my phone is always there. I'm always looking up stuff like, okay, what is the dosage of this? Like you're going to forget those small things, but we also have pharmacy on call, which really helps. So it's always a team setting. If I need help with like, say a case, say if a patient needs to be intubated, I'm like, hey, I haven't intubated in a while. I'll talk to the emerge doc. Even though the emerge doc has 40 patients waiting, he'll be like, all right, he'll come by, help intubate the patient, and then we take it from there. Or if there's like certain procedures that I'm not really good at doing, I can ask for help too. But in general, we learn a few procedures that we're pretty good at and we should be good at. There's competencies in it. And then we do them if we need to. But overnight, it's very hard to do certain procedures because you're just so busy. You're getting paged like constantly.
I mean, you said this is stressful.
Yeah.
Right? What is the stress like? What's the source of the stress? How do you alleviate it now that you have so much experience? What advice would you give to somebody on manage stress? Like, it's a stupid question for me to ask. Like, is it stressful? It's stressful. Like, people are dying left, right, and center around you, right? So now that you have some experience, how do you manage that stress? Like, what aggravates it? What lessens it?
I would say, so stress management, the number one thing is like being able to communicate with your colleagues. They become friends, being able to like speak with your like partner and like just not with confidence, right? You're basically kind of sometimes just running your mouth about like cases that get you really annoyed or really stressed out, or you learn about it, or, you know, a very difficult family or something like that. Then you're kind of just like angry about it. You just need to release tension. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is definitely exercise. Is always important. Meditation is important. Being able to compartmentalize is extremely important. Like, you know, you have one patient that died and then you have another one that's crashing. You can't just linger on that one. You have to like compartmentalize it, go to this, and then you go back and revisit it after. But it's good especially if they're tough cases, there's debriefing that occurs after like say a tough case. And then you have the nursing staff and everything. And we kind of talk out the case. And I find that by communicating, talking it out, it really helps relieve a little bit of the tension. But I would say, you know, exercise, diet, obviously diet is important, you know, the same wellness things. But on top of that, being able to kind of be open and not be judged about, say, certain things you do or how it's done, and learning from your mistakes. Because it's called practice. Everybody's going to make mistakes. It's just, you're not trying to do egregious mistakes. You're just trying to do the best you can with the information you have available at that time.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
But what are your sources of stress?
For the hospital itself, I'll be honest, I don't really get stressed being in work. The only stress is really emails. I hate emails. I'm really bad at that. You know, doing some research, like I'm doing some quality improvement, those things stress me out. Doing a presentation, that stresses me out. Being with patient care and billing and all this stuff, that doesn't stress me out at all. I love all of it. I'm just one of the weird ones that loves every moment of it. There's times where I get irritated and upset. Like if I get paged in the middle of the night for, oh, this patient needs a pill for constipation. Meanwhile, there's a patient that's in a code blue. I'm like, don't call me for this, page me for this, right? So there's certain things like that. But in general, I mean, the nurses are great. The teams are great. Everybody's constantly learning. And I love that. And I love that, like also where I'm working is that a lot of my colleagues are like friends. We're around the same age. Some are older, some are younger, but we learn from each other. And it's a non-judgmental area and it's fun, man. Like every moment of it's fun. Like following up on your patients down the road, be like, oh, was I right with this diagnosis, whatever. It's cool. It's very cool. I mean, I would say you probably only see 20-30% of the stuff you learn in med school, but sometimes you see the rare shit. Like I had a few rare cases the other day. I'm like, wow, I haven't seen this since med school. Like I had a guy with Lyme disease who had all the presentation of Lyme disease. Like I've only read this in a textbook. Somebody told me like a patient never reads the textbook, which means they never present the same way. Yeah. It's like, right. So, but it's cool. It's a lot of detective work. It's a lot of,
you got a tick.
Huh?
Yeah,
tick. Yeah, a tick. Yeah.
What do you do? Is that really, really harmful? Because where I live, like that's a big problem.
There's lots of ticks. There depends on what bacteria they're keeping. And it also depends on what you're presenting with. There's lots of stuff.
Is it life-threatening?
Yeah, it depends. There's a certain version that can be, but this one I had to admit because it could have been life-threatening. His heart kind of like was stopping for seconds at a time, but it's usually treated. So we were able to treat it.
That's good. So I'm pretty sure it's not, but do you feel like the job ever gets redundant now that you've been in it for a while?
Zero. Right? I would say maybe some of the the management styles can be similar, but every patient is different. Every story is different. Even the clinical examination is different. Even how they're managed is different. So somebody who comes in with heart failure, they can have like 0 comorbidities, or they can have like 100 comorbidities, but their management can be different. The practice and the pharmacological stuff that's out there now is changing. The guidelines are changing, constantly learning new things. No single day is the same. That's what I love about it. Not a single day is the same.
Mm.
If it was, I think it could get boring. Like, that's why I don't like subspecialties. No offense to subspecialties. I think they're great. I mean, obviously they need more training because they're way smarter, but I just love internal medicine because we see everything. Like, it's not just one area. And that's what I love about it. And also what I love about it is that I may not know the answer. If you're a subspecialist, you kind of have more of that. It's like, oh, I don't know the answer. Let's just give it to somebody else who might know. So that's what I like about it too. Like, I can't know it all.
You can.
Yeah, 100%.
Whereas if you're a subspecialty, you're
The buck
typically
stops
the
with you.
last.
Yeah,
Okay.
but there's even
It's like,
subspecialties.
if you don't know,
Yeah.
we have a problem in a lawsuit.
Man.
But okay, now let's talk about. I know you said don't do it for the money.
Yeah.
But let's be honest, man. How much do doctors earn? And,
I can only talk about internal medicine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Talk to me about internal medicine.
I think internal medicine in Canada makes probably the most, probably around the world. I think so. We make more than the States. I think on average, it's different what you see on the websites than in general, but you're probably looking at about, $400,000 to $500,000, $400,000 to $500,000. There's a lot of taxes and everything too, but that's if you're working a lot, right? It's fee for service. So it's different. In the States in general, it's like a salary based. So you get a certain salary and you get bonuses. Here, it's every patient you see, that's what you bill, right? So there's pros and cons to that because if you're lazy, you're not going to be making much. The pros are if you're seeing a lot of patients, it's great, but you have to have that balance. You can't see so many patients and not do safe care. So there's that balance, right? And it depends how many hours you work. Like, I can say not work for a week or two. I can just ask for vacation. I would say 95% of the time I get the vacation I ask for. But the other side of it too is I'm usually working 2 weekends of the month. And my wife, who's also a physician, like the two of us spending time together, it's hard. So it's trying to get that life balance. And I think that's important, but we didn't talk about that. We're talking right now about money. You can make a lot. You can make some money on there. Like, to put in perspective, a ward week for me may be about 7,500 to at that 10,000. A night could be up to 10 to 12,000 in
A night.
In one night.
One night.
Up to. Usually it's between 8 to 10, but it really depends on how busy you are and depends on what you're seeing and depends how many you're handing over, depends how often you're going up and down the stairs to see all these patients. So it really depends. And then on a clinic, it's probably 12 to 1,500, but it's really how you're stacking your clinics, right? So you can make a lot of money. But other side of it, what did I get into once I became a staff? I was probably over 300 grand in debt, 300 to 400 grand in debt. So, and I've started my life, took longer. I know you and me were same path in terms of like timeline before we started working. But like a lot of our other boys, a lot of our other friends are like, they've been working for years. They've been saving for years. They've had houses before. They have kids. They've had all this. So there's like a little bit of a delay in terms of other aspects. But in general, you're very well compensated in general internal medicine.
Yeah, I would agree. And no matter how much we say, like, the funny joke I've always had is like all brown people need to be doctors. The reason was money because everyone had their immigrant story, right?
Mm-hmm.
And immigrants struggle to make money.
Yeah.
They found that this profession guarantees a lot of money and the next generation will be well off, right? So it is good that they earn a lot of money and they do well for them. I mean, they study like crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, becoming a lawyer is like a joke, it feels like, in comparison.
Bro.
Relatively speaking, it's very difficult to become a lawyer. It's extremely difficult to become a doctor, right? And then you think about all the subspecialties, surgeons, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
It's like, Lord have mercy. You're pretty much going to be, you're a student for life in general, but like when you're actually being tested all the time, like that adds up.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think I have the patience to become a surgeon, for instance. Like 15 years, that's a lot of foresight, man. Like a lot of things can happen in 15 years. But yeah, I mean, doctors definitely they're at the top in terms of professions. I don't know many professions that earn more money. I think investment banking, at some point, accountants, like lawyers, they can surpass that because like partners, they like, it kind of depends on how the firm is actually doing. Yeah. But in terms of salary, it's like doctors are right at the top, I think.
Once again, depends on the specialty, right?
Yeah.
Like
even family doctors, for instance, they earn like 300 grand.
I think they should deserve more, to be honest, but
Yeah.
it's just that's where the biggest burnout is. It's a huge burnout there because
but they make more too, right?
They-
So it's
they
like
could,
like
yeah.
most of them on average earn about 300, and then some earn even more, right?
So to put it in perspective, so it's fee for service, right?
Yeah.
So there's two different, I think, versions for family. I'm not a family doc, but from what I heard, there's a version of it where you take on a cohort of patients and you get paid kind of like a salary. There's another word, fee for service. But to put it in perspective, you're really getting like, if you have like a patient that comes in, like it's like $10 or 20, like 10 to $15 you're seeing per patient. They can ask you 1,000 things, right? So it's like, it's not that well compensated at all. Like I think family med needs to, like, I think BC started to give family docs more money. But I think that's really what it is, the incentive, because there's not enough family docs. We need more of those. And then what ends up happening is that all these patients who don't see family docs end up going to the Emerge as their primary care. And then they end up seeing us after they see the Emerge. And then they find out like, oh, I have diabetes now. I have a high blood pressure now. I have had a heart attack. So we really need primary care. And that's the tough part. That's really hard to get. I think they need to be compensated more. General internal medicine, we're well compensated. I think you could always ask for more. Everybody could always ask for more. We're also paying a lot of tax, but it doesn't matter.
That's a different thing.
Yeah.
Like, and you learn you have to incorporate.
Incorporation's a thing.
Yeah. So doctors can incorporate. Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, my brother Ankur could probably tell you more about that, but essentially incorporation, they allow that in Canada, I think last 10, 20 years. Basically, your entity as the medical corporation is where you get all the money. So I bill and everything through the corporation, then the corporation kind of pays me money outside of that. So it's a good way to save some taxes. That's for sure.
Save a lot of taxes because you pay corporate tax, right? And personal income tax, which is quite a bit in America. I mean, in Canada. All right. So are there any special perks to being a doc?
Yeah, man. I mean, just being blessed, man. Just having this idea that...
special things that you would only get not being blessed. Like everyone gets an income, right? For instance, you can prescribe medicine.
Yeah.
That's a perk, man.
Yeah, it's a perk. But you can't really prescribe it for patients. Like I can't prescribe for my family. I was like, oh, I need some of this. I'm like, no, I can't do this. You need to actually see me physically. Like there's an ethical component to that, right?
Yeah.
So you can't do that. But in terms of like, yeah, we have something called the Ontario Medical Association, which gives us perks on a lot of things, like in terms of discounts in hotels, travel, like whenever there's these events, like say a learning event or a lecture event, say if it's in the States or somewhere, we can go to that and it's like our corporations pay for it because it's like all medical learning, but you're in a nice place. Like 2 years ago, I went to Hawaii for a Mayo clinic for internal medicine. Mm-hmm. That was awesome. And that was like mainly expensed by the corporation because we're learning about stuff, but you're also getting a chance to see stuff, which is pretty cool. Like being in Hawaii is great. So there's that. There's like, I guess also, I know it sounds bad to say, but there's like a little bit of like, people look at you a little differently when they're like, oh, you're a doctor. Like, oh, right. But the reality is like, we're all just humans. We're all the same thing. So actually, I don't like to tell people I'm a physician. I just say, oh, I'm in medical care. Right. So, but you know, other than that,
opposite for lawyers.
Oh yeah. They like to let you know, especially in the hospital. They're like, oh yeah, I'm a lawyer. I'm like, oh, okay.
No, I'm saying like,
a little bit better.
Doctors get the respect. The second people find out you're a lawyer, sure, they respect you, but they're like a little scared. Right? They're like, oh man.
I hope he doesn't trip on his way out.
Oh man. Dr. Gray said that too. Respect is definitely one. Yeah. I mean, you guys save lives for a living. Right? Yeah. Respect is definitely due. Yeah. If you let it get to your head, then I mean, there's level of arrogance you're treading. Yeah. But I don't think, I mean, you lose respect then, right?
Yeah.
But definitely in the medical profession, you deserve some respect, a lot of respect. You only studied for like half your life. Your entire prime was dedicated to school, and there was a sacrifice associated with that. And so, I mean, respect is definitely due. And so let's see. You told me I want to talk about work-life balance, and you said that. So it's going to be difficult for you to quantify how many hours you work on average because you're going to have clinical weeks, ward weeks, and stuff like that, right? So, but I think I kind of understand it now because like subspecialties typically work somewhere between 40 and 50 hours because
clinics.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Whereas if you work in a hospital setting,
Yeah.
things are bizarre. And I mean, depending on how bad it was,
Yeah.
you're going to work different hours on a weekly basis,
Yeah.
right? Can you say there's an average?
I would say for me, so I work probably more than some of my other colleagues, but for me, my average is probably 50 to 60. But some weeks it's like 20 hours. For example, this weekend I just did two, which is not usually recommended, but I did do it. I did basically 34 hours in 2 days. So, which is not usually what we do, but I did that. And then before that, I did like another 16-hour shift. So it's like, it can vary, but an average for me personally is between 40 to, so say 50 hours. Sometimes it's like up to 80. Sometimes it's like 20. Sometimes it's none. But yeah, it varies. It does vary. And I think,
Well, your wife is also
Yes.
a doctor. She's somebody with a subspecialty.
yes.
How many hours does she work?
So Melissa, Dr. Bridgebassi from respirology. So she does respirology, and for her, she does 3 days of clinic a week. She organizes her own clinic. So she's like, I want to see this many patients, or I want to dial back. So for her, she does 3 days of clinic a week, say like 9 to like 3, 9 to 4. And then the week she's on service at at her hospital, she does like, she's basically 24/7 call, but she usually goes in every day for like a few hours or up to like 12 to 14 hours. It really depends how busy the week is. So she has a really good work-life balance. That's what I'm striving for in the future.
Can you ever change your subspecialty? Can you like go back to school for a
You
year?
you could always go back, but why would you? Why would you take the pay cut? Why would you do something where you're basically
For work-life balance.
no, but then you're spending a year, say, for example, if I wanted to do, say, sleep medicine. So I'd spend a year doing that, shadowing a physician or something. You still work on the side, so you could still make money. But like, I don't know. I love what I do right now, but you could. So for example, in internal medicine, you could also become a little bit more specialized in, say, for example, thrombosis. You can be very like interested in like respirology care. You could be very interested in cardiology. So I have some of my colleagues that not just read these, we all read ECGs, but they read the echoes. They do the stress tests. So internal medicine, we're allowed to do a lot, right? It's just how much time you put in. There's competencies, of course, for that, but we're able to really do a lot. Like in general, specialist would not go back into internal medicine in general because it's just too much breadth of knowledge and it's just too chaotic. And then their specialty is like their specialty, right? So yeah, not a lot of people go backwards to internal medicine. Most people go into a subspecialty, but yeah.
So you're an internal medicine guy, so you don't have work-life balance.
I mean, I still think I do, but I think I'm
Tell
better
me about this.
I'm better.
How do you have 60-hour weeks with work-life balance?
So 50 to 60, right? So
Most weeks, what do you have?
like 40 to 60.
When I
don't
talk
know.
to you, it sounds like you've never taken a day off.
I know. I'm
and
always
you've never
working.
slept either, right?
No, I'm trying to sleep. I say sleep is very important. I think I sleep too much, but I need the sleep. But yeah, no, it's challenging. And I think it's over time, I think I'm going to slowly dial back. But that's the beauty of it. You can do as much as you want, do as little as you want. Like I have one of my colleagues is a retired internist, and now she just works in the clinic, like the medical urgent care clinic. She just does it like because she loves it still. And we need help. We always need help. So you could always dial back. You're obviously taking a big pay cut. Right now, I'm just trying to grind a little bit more, and I still love it. I'm still young, or like I'm not young, but I feel that I still have energy. But over time, I'm going to be dialing back. Like this is still less than residency. And that's why I think residency is important, because you got to go through the grind, because that's going to just, then it lets you know that you can handle it, right? You can handle these hours. There's no 24-hour call, like as a staff. That becomes dangerous, because you're like the last one making the decision, right? As a resident, it's different. You have different layers and levels, but there's still levels in the community hospital. But yeah, it's just, you don't want to be working too much either, because the biggest thing is burnout. That's really what it comes down to.
So you said you feel like you have work-life balance.
I don't think so. I think I'm a little bit more skewed to work than life, but it's better than it was before. So I feel like this is an intervention right now. But yeah, no, I still love it a lot. I'm still very passionate.
I don't think I have
about it.
work-life balance.
I think you do.
I don't.
I feel like, I mean, the fact that you're doing this on top of, having a kid, spending time with family, chatting, giving us calls all the time. I think you have a great balance, and
So
especially
I
working.
execute
Yeah.
to like maintain
Mhm.
relationships. That's
Yeah.
different,
That's amazing.
right? It's something like, for instance, I don't listen to music anymore.
Really?
And the reason is
That's depressing.
I know it sucks.
You
And you
love
know how much I
music.
love music.
Yeah.
I love music more than most.
Yeah.
But in order to talk to people
Yeah.
whose relationships I would like to preserve,
Yeah.
I call them instead.
So
right?
you know what we should do next time? Call me and we'll play a song.
Oh my
We'll
God.
chat.
All right. So this went off topic.
Yeah, sorry.
Back to work-life balance.
Yeah.
Do you think your wife feels she has work-life balance?
I think she has a good balance. For me, I think she believes I don't
I'm
have a
talking
good
about
balance.
her.
Yeah.
Let's talk about her.
Yeah, she has a good balance. I
She has
believe
good
so.
balance?
Yeah.
So it seems like if you're in subspecialties, you have work-life balance because
It depends on your subspecialty,
Yeah.
right? So, and it's how many hours you want to work and what you want to do and what the
you have a
demands
bit
are.
more control over your schedule when you're in a subspecialty,
It depends.
except for when you're called into a hospital,
Yes.
right? And
yes.
how frequent is that?
So, for example, for Mel, it's if she's called in, like you're on call for a week, so it's technically 24/7. So you can be called anytime. The only true physicians that really need to be in hospital is the emerge doc, is the intensivist if they're in house, and the internist. Anything else, you usually have 24 to 48 hours to figure it out for a consult, because it's not really going to be, it's the life-threatening things that need to be dealt with right away. But generally speaking, most consultants come in within 12 to 24 hours of being consulted. But the beauty of being a subspecialist is that you don't have to come in right away. Like surgery is a completely different category. They have to come in like obviously right away if someone has like a stab wound or something. But in general, yeah, like you can wait. Like neurology, for example, has to come in right away if it's a code stroke, right? So there is, every subspecialty has their times where they're needed and they have to be there right away. But some specialties like allergy, immunology, they just make their clinic schedule and that's it. They're never called into hospital. Dermatology. I actually had to have a colleague who's a dermatologist who actually helped me diagnose like an extremely rare condition that's very life-threatening. But doesn't come into the hospital. We just talk about it and then he sees them in the clinic the next day. So everybody is like, I think everybody has their time where they have to be called in, but there's flexibility. I think at the end of the day, there's flexibility for most areas. But in internal medicine, it can be very flexible or you can work until you're like collapse. So
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So, I mean, very tough profession, but we know you wanted to be a doctor since you were yay high.
yeah.
What do you love or like about this profession?
So first of all, I love the idea that when you're seeing someone, just being a physician in general, just loving the fact that you can help someone when they're in need and you might be able to help them. That's number one. Number two is that I just love the clinical thinking about what's going on with patients. Like when they come in, their presentations, I love to integrate like imaging, blood work, vitals, the story. Like it's a lot of integration of everything all the time. I like to see a lot of data. So I love to data crunch everything. And over time you get better at it. So I love that. I love like seeing the management, the changes, just the practice of it. I love that. I love that every day is different. I love that every patient's different. Every family is different. I love that, everybody kind of looks at you in a certain way. Yes, you shouldn't look at it that way, but yeah, there's respect that you get. Yeah, we're humans. We get that respect. I love that. Like, my colleagues, my friends, they're all collegial. Everybody's great with each other. There's always the bad things that happen, like bad patient outcomes or families are very crazy.
That's next question, man.
But yeah.
What
Anyway,
do you dislike about the profession of medicine?
I
guess no. What do you dislike or find challenging about being a doctor?
I would say the number one thing is the what do you call it? Not billing, but it's more like the documentation. Billing's annoying, but it's documentation than billing. And then another thing that's actually, I think, a big part of burnout that I think a lot of my colleagues would agree upon is family dynamics and chatting with patients and families. Like most of the time I like it, but there's that 10 to 20% of the times where they just drain your energy. Because really like sometimes it's just like, I had a patient the other day who just believed, oh no, I can treat my leukemia by just going to my alternative doctor and cleaning my blood. I'm like, no, you're going to die if you don't go get chemo. Like I literally diagnosed you with this. You have to stay. You're bleeding out. Like what's going on? And she's like, no. My alternative doctor will help me. She knows what's going on. And then she leaves against medical advice despite me trying all my efforts. So that's the annoying part. Like where some people are just like, just don't give a shit. But then she came back and we're able to help her. But regardless, like there's those patients, then there's patients that are just the families are extremely involved. And that's also a burnout situation because they can ask you a ton of questions. And the reality is that patients or families think that, oh, we only spend like a second with the family. No, we're actually literally sitting down, reviewing everything, liaising with everybody, writing the notes, organizing everything. So there's like 90% of the time is actually spent outside of that room, outside of that patient. But yeah, like if, for example, even in the emerge, like if a patient's referred to me in the emerge, I've already reviewed them, already kind of have an idea of what's going on, already organized my notes, already ordered everything. But then when I see them, they're like, oh, nobody's seen us for like 6 hours. Like, yeah, I've seen you in the chart. I know what's going on. I see what's happening. This is what we're going on. Then they're happy about that. But then they hate waiting, right? But nobody likes waiting. But it's like, no, sorry, you're not sick enough to be seen right away. That's the reality. But yeah. So that I would say is like the burnout part.
Administrative burden.
Yeah, yes.
Like
Yeah.
the administration of a hospital
Yeah.
influences patients and how they think about you and
Yeah.
whether you really care or not.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is what it is. I
It
mean,
is
that's a big thing. Like since I've been here, now that I've lived in Canada and America, it's a huge complaint in Canada. And the thing is, I can't concur because every time I've gone to a Canadian hospital, like the most I've waited, I think was like 3.5, 4 hours.
Yeah.
Right. I went with my dad.
Yeah.
And we came at 2 and we were gone by, I think 6:30.
That's actually really fast.
Right. Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
When I took my mom to surgery, it was a great experience.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I just don't, I'm sure other people aren't lying.
Yeah.
Right. I had some aunts that told me they waited 12 hours and, for, they got into a car accident and, it wasn't serious.
Yeah.
And they were waiting for 12 to 14 hours.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow, that's long.
Yeah. It could be long if you're not sick. I mean, you're sick enough to be there. It's just like how sick. That's the reality. And then
Fair
there's
enough.
also tests that you're waiting for and everything to come back. So there's a lot of things that go into why patients wait that long. I mean, even for myself, I was having chest pain in the hospital while I was working. And that still took me like 4 to 5 hours before I was able to be discharged. Like after I finished my shift, and then I like spent 5 hours for something that I could have figured out in like 2 minutes. But it just, and that's me working in the hospital. So it's just because I wasn't dying, right?
Yeah.
So, this is with me talking to my colleagues who are in Emerge. So it's slow for everybody if you're not sick. That's the reality.
Now that you have quite a bit of experience, what advice?
Not a lot of experience, but yeah, a good amount.
Man, you have quite a bit of experience.
Yeah.
Like since 2016, that's like 8 years. So I mean, going into 9, to me, you're pretty competent at this stage of life. What advice would you give to the Anil that was pretty much starting off as a resident? Because I mean, for doctors, that is such a stressful time. Like, what advice would you give to your actually no? What advice would you give to your younger self? There's so many things that you learn along the way. What kind of tidbits would like help?
So number one, I don't know if I would give much advice because I feel like I turned out the way I turned out because of all the experiences I had, the good and the bad. But what I would say is that, number one is be more studious. When I was in grade school and high school, do more activities. That would be the second. Third is just don't put all your eggs in one basket because it might not have worked out. Try to think of different other areas, but also, believe that you can do this. And then, it's never too late. That would be another set of advice I would give to my younger self, to my residency self, to my first year of an internal medicine residency. I would say it's okay to stress. It's okay to feel imposter syndrome. Just talk about it and don't give up. It will get better. It's very hard at the beginning, especially being an international medical graduate. Like the Canadian med students that are residents are way up on you. They know way more. They just know the system better. They know everything better. They're just smart. They're brilliant. But don't compare yourself. Know what you're good at. Know that you got there and that you can do this. It's just going to take time. Yeah. So I would say that would be kind of the advice as a resident. Yeah.
What did you mean by it's never too late?
Like I've seen people that started residency in their 40s. I've seen, not here, but like in the States where I've heard, I've seen people go to med school later in life. It's harder. It's definitely harder putting everything on pause, but it's possible. It's possible. Anything's possible. Like for me, from undergrad, I was debating, should I do my master's first before I apply? I'm glad I applied right away, but I applied to the Caribbean, right? So, and that was lucky. I was lucky. I would say now it's a lot tougher to go through the Caribbean routes than it was before, and especially to get back in. But yes, we're looking for more physicians in Canada and in the States, but it's just getting harder and more challenging. I would say it's easier to get in to an American school or a Canadian school, and that's what you should gun for. Because now going to the Caribbean route, like there's also Australia and Ireland. That's a very different discussion altogether. But it's very tough getting back, and you got to grind. And that's really what it comes down to.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
You said you need to have belief in yourself, but you should also keep your options open.
Mhm.
I hear an oxymoron.
So what I mean by
and the reason why,
that's a good question. Good.
Because
Yeah.
it's like, I feel people only give such advice after the fact,
That's true.
right?
That's true.
While you're going through it, I'm not sure if that's great advice. I feel like you need crazy belief, right? Because it's such a rough journey, right? And you can have your options open after, right? After you fail, or after you don't actually get the opportunity to go down that particular route. Because if you don't have that level of commitment, how do you stay motivated when you're so immature as a high school student and so mature as an undergrad student? Like, you need that level of belief, I feel.
That's true, actually. That's a good point, Shake. So maybe I dial back and agree with that. I would say, yeah, you gotta have this like belief that you can do it. Like no matter what, you could do it. And you have to say it's your last option. In your mind, there should not be other options. So you're right. I want to correct what I said. You got to say, this is the last option. This is the only option. My back is against the wall. There's nothing else there. You have to do this. There's nothing else for you after that.
That's what I've seen with doctors.
Yeah. Well, but then some people can get really super stressed and depressed, and that's a whole other category of like things to talk about.
I feel like that's a conversation about coping mechanisms and how you need to learn that at a younger age.
Yeah.
And maybe the system needs to teach that, right? Because you're going to experience stress in many different areas of life, right? If you're becoming a doctor, I really, really think everyone should know that it's going to be a rough journey.
Yeah.
It's going to be great if you're passionate about it and all that.
Yeah.
That's cool. But it's going to be a rough journey.
Yeah.
Right. And I feel like you need a very, very strong sense of belief along the journey to remind yourself why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, anywho, I shut off.
Well said, Shay.
Thank you. I close all episodes by asking people, what is the best career advice that you have received along the journey?
It's just love what you do. That's really what it is. Don't do it because you're told to do it. Do it because you genuinely love it or you believe you'll love it. I would say that's the best advice.
And along the journey, what is the worst career advice you have received?
Oh yeah, it's like do it for the money. Choose this profession. It's so easy. Like go into it that mentality, that attitude. So that's the worst advice I got. It's like, oh, you should do this area because it's easy way to make money, or this is an easier way to write the examination, or here's an exam. Let's just use this and then we can write the exam and cheat. So it's like the worst advice I've ever given is like, oh, just focus on your grades and get good grades by like cheating. Don't fucking do that. There's no point in doing that because you're just cheating yourself down the road. Oh, that's what I would say is the worst advice.
Seems like never take the easy way out in this field because it's just going to screw you later.
I mean, it's just advice for everybody. Like you don't want to take the easy way out. I think it's not the result. It's really the journey. That's what makes you or who you are and what you're.
In general, I've learned that. There was a lot of people in high school that wanted to take the easy way out and they didn't want to study. And that's okay. Like, I don't think education is the only way in order to make money. But I'm just saying, like, the thought process, taking the easy way out has consequences, right? And it can screw you later in life.
Yeah.
And so that's good non-advice to provide. Well, it was great, man. Thank you for taking the time and discussing the profession from the MD route.
Yes.
Now we know both. So, and I think it's very helpful for people that are coming from the Caribbean to get deep insight about how national graduates ought to find some success in the field. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Shake. You know what I just realized? I didn't have my blazer on this entire chat.
You should have put your lab coat on.
I know
man.
that. No, screw that. Nobody wears a white coat anymore.
Oh,
That's
okay,
not a.
okay.
It's not a thing.
Oh, okay. Okay.
It just causes dirt.
Oh.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it was good, man.
Thank you.
All
Peace.
right, bye. Well, that's it for this episode of the My Career Shop podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you have a better idea of how to become a doctor via the MD route. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, leave a review, and comment on what profession you want me to invite next and what other information you would be interested in listening to. See you soon.